3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Sarah Chen counted them all. Every sunrise since Thomas died, she set out his coffee mug on the kitchen table. Same spot he always placed it, next to the newspaper he would never read again. Her daughter called it unhealthy. Sarah called it love, the kind that doesn't stop just because a heart does. The morning light filtered through lace curtains Thomas had hung himself, back when his hands were steady and his laugh came easy. Sarah sat across from his empty chair, her own coffee growing cold, his journal open to the last entry he ever made. The handwriting grew shakier toward the end. She'd memorized every word 3 years ago, but still read them each morning like a prayer to a saint who couldn't answer back. The mailman's truck rumbled up the gravel drive at 8:17, same as always. Sarah rose slowly. 73 years had taught her body to protest sudden movements, especially in the mountain cold of western North Carolina. The envelope waiting in the box looked official, white, crisp, with the Riverbend Estates HOA logo embossed in gold, addressed to Thomas Chen. She carried it inside like it might shatter, set it on the table next to his mug, and opened it with fingers that remembered steadier days. Final notice. Property lien proceeding. $4,800 owed for sidewalk maintenance assessment dating back 4 years. Payment due within 30 days or foreclosure proceedings would commence. Sarah read it twice. Thomas had been the HOA treasurer. He would have known about any legitimate assessments. He documented everything with the precision of a man who believed numbers told the truth, even when people lied. This bill made no sense, unless someone was counting on her not questioning it, counting on her being just another grieving widow too tired to fight back. She looked at his photo on the mantel. 73 years old, and she could still see the young man who'd courted her with terrible poetry and honest eyes, the man who'd raised their daughter to ask questions and demand answers, the man who died 3 years ago from a heart attack the doctor said came from stress. But what kind of stress? She'd wondered then, and never stopped wondering. The morning Thomas died, he'd been preparing documents, bank statements, vendor invoices, spreadsheets covered with his careful notations. He'd been agitated for weeks, staying up late in his office, making quiet phone calls, meeting people she didn't recognize. When she asked, he'd kissed her forehead and said he was working on something important, something that mattered. 2 days after they buried him, the HOA had sent flowers. Beautiful arrangement, white lilies, expensive. The card read, "Some battles aren't worth fighting." She'd thought it an odd thing to write to a widow. Now, holding this fraudulent bill, those words took on weight they'd never shed. Sarah set the letter down and did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She opened the closet in Thomas's office, the one she'd locked the day after the funeral and sworn she'd never touch again. Inside, boxes labeled in his handwriting, HOA files, board minutes, financial records, and on top, an envelope that made her breath catch. Heavy paper, her name written across it in his hand. Beneath her name, 4 words that stop time. If something happens. Across town, on the far edge of where Riverbend Estates technically existed, Marcus Hayes stood on a bridge he'd built with his own hands and tried to remember why he'd bothered. 18 months since Linda died. 18 months since cancer took the only person who'd ever really understood the particular brand of stubborn that ran in his blood. He'd built this bridge to honor the dream she never got to live. Retirement cabin by the river, she'd written in her bucket list journal. Somewhere we can hear the water and forget the world exists. He'd found the cabin 3 months after she passed. Rustic, the listing said. Needs work. Access road washed out. Most people would have walked away. Marcus saw a project, something to fill the hours that stretched empty without her voice calling him to dinner. Her laughter at his terrible jokes, her hand reaching for his in the dark. The bridge had taken 6 weekends. Steel beams he'd sourced from a demolished factory, pressure-treated lumber, concrete footings sunk deep into bedrock. He'd overbuilt it by any reasonable standard. Engineering overkill for a span crossing 40 feet of creek that rarely rose above knee depth. But Marcus had spent 30 years designing structures that wouldn't fail, couldn't fail, because failure meant people died. Old habits ran deeper than grief. He'd welded the last beam on a Saturday morning with Linda's photo propped against his toolbox. talked to her the whole time like she could hear him, told her about the cantilever design she'd never understood, the load calculations that would bore her to tears, the satisfaction of work done right. When he finished, he'd sat on the deck and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not because the bridge was done, because she'd never walk across it. The envelope arrived that afternoon. Crisp white gold embossed logo. $8,400 owed for shared bridge maintenance and structural upgrades. Marcus read it standing in his cabin kitchen, still wearing his welding gloves, grease on his hands making dark prints on the expensive paper. He laughed. Couldn't help it. The kind of laugh that comes when absurdity crashes into exhaustion, and you've got nothing left but the sound. They wanted him to pay for maintaining a bridge he'd built himself, on his own property, with his own money and sweat and the weight of a dead wife's dream pushing every beam into place. His engineer's mind kicked in before the anger could. He spread the county survey maps across his dining table, cross-referenced the property deed, pulled the permits he'd filed himself after the county inspector asked if he was really doing this alone. Every line was clear. The bridge sat entirely on his private parcel. No easements, no shared access, no community infrastructure designation. Just his land and his work and a bill that existed because someone thought he wouldn't fight back. Marcus almost didn't. Almost wrote the check just to avoid the hassle of dealing with people and meetings and the exhausting machinery of bureaucracy. Linda used to handle that stuff. She'd been good with people, knew how to navigate conflicts without making enemies, could smile and disarm and get what she wanted through charm instead of confrontation. Marcus built things, solved problems with math and metal and concrete that behaved according to predictable laws of physics. But then he remembered something she'd said, near the end, when the cancer had stolen most of her strength but none of her fire. Marcus Hayes, you never met an injustice you didn't challenge. Don't let grief make you small. He picked up the phone and called the county records office. The building smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee, exactly what Marcus expected from small-town government. The clerk behind the counter looked like she'd been fighting paper cuts since before he was born, but her eyes were sharp when he explained what he needed. Land surveys, HOA incorporation documents, easement records for the Riverbend Estates area. She disappeared into the back and returned 10 minutes later with a stack of files that raised dust when she set them down. Marcus spread them across the public records table, his phone camera ready, his engineering training kicking in. He documented everything, photographed every page, cross-referenced dates and signatures and property descriptions. His parcel showed clean, no easements recorded, no shared infrastructure designations, no community access corridors, just a private lot bordered by creek on 3 sides and forest on the 4th. The only thing resembling what the HOA claimed was a footnote in a planning proposal from 15 years ago, proposed emergency access route connecting County Road to watershed area. Status stamped in red ink, rejected by County Planning Board. They'd tried to create the legal framework for claiming his bridge and failed, but apparently decided to act like it existed anyway, hoping he wouldn't know better, wouldn't check, wouldn't care enough to fight over $8,000 when fighting meant time and energy and engagement with a world he'd been trying to escape. Marcus photographed the rejection stamp, made copies of every relevant document, built his case the way he built structures, with every support verified and every load calculated and redundancy built in, because you never knew what stress the system would face. On his way out, he nearly collided with a woman carrying a box of files. Her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the afternoon heat, her expression sharp enough to cut glass. She looked at him the way people look at obstacles in their path. He stepped aside. She swept past without acknowledgement. The name on her visitor badge read Patricia Thornhill, HOA President. Marcus watched her disappear into the clerk's office, already talking before the door fully closed. Something about his interaction with the records clerk shifted. The older woman's expression had gone carefully neutral, professional, the kind of neutral that meant trouble recognized. That evening, Marcus installed cameras around his property. Trail cameras disguised as birdhouses, motion-activated, uploading to cloud storage every hour. His military friends used to joke that engineers made terrible soldiers because they overthought everything. But they made excellent planners because they assumed everything that could go wrong would go wrong. If the HOA was willing to bill him fraudulently in writing, they'd escalate. People who lied in official documents didn't stop at paperwork. They'd try something physical, plant evidence, create the emergency access route they claimed existed. Marcus had seen enough bureaucratic overreach in his career to know how it worked. Manufacture the problem, then charge people to fix it. He finished mounting the last camera as sunset painted the creek gold and red. The bridge stood solid beneath the changing light. Every weld perfect, every beam true. Linda would have loved this view. She'd always been the one who noticed sunsets while he calculated angles. He wished she was here to see what he'd built. Wished even more that she was here to tell him what to do next. The decision came from an unexpected source. The next morning, Marcus drove into town for supplies and ran into a woman at the hardware store. Late 60s, sharp eyes behind librarian glasses, moving through the aisles with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she needed. She noticed him studying the security camera selection and offered unsolicited advice about motion sensitivity and battery life. Janet Kowalski, retired paralegal, she introduced herself, lived in Riverbend Estates for 40 years, currently fighting her own HOA battle over garden gnomes that supposedly violated aesthetic standards that didn't exist in the actual covenants. They talked for 20 minutes in the electrical aisle, compared bills and violation notices, and the growing sense that something was systematically wrong with how the HOA operated. Janet mentioned others. Elderly residents charged for services never rendered. Young families threatened with liens over invented violations. A pattern of targeting people who seemed least likely to fight back. Before they parted, Janet pressed a folded paper into his hand, an address written in neat script. Sarah Chen, she said. Her husband Thomas was HOA treasurer, died suddenly 3 years ago, right after he started asking questions about where money was really going. If anyone knows what's happening, it's her. She's been quiet since he passed. Too quiet. Maybe it's time someone reminded her she doesn't have to be. Marcus stood in the parking lot looking at the address, feeling the weight of a choice he hadn't planned to make. He'd come to Riverbend to be alone, to build his bridge, and hide from a world that felt wrong without Linda in it. Getting involved in HOA politics meant people and conflict and caring about things beyond his property line. But he could hear Linda's voice clear as mountain air. Some things matter more than your comfort, Marcus. Sometimes you have to care even when it hurts. He drove to Sarah Chen's house before he could talk himself out of it. The woman who answered the door looked fragile at first glance. Thin in that way grief makes people. Silver hair pulled back in a simple style. Cardigan wrapped tight despite the warm afternoon. But her eyes were anything but fragile. They assessed Marcus with the sharpness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. He explained who he was and why Janet had sent him, feeling awkward in a way he hadn't felt since Linda died. She'd been his buffer with people, his translator for social situations that required more than technical competence. Without her, he was just an engineer standing on a stranger's porch, asking about dead husbands and fraud. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let him in. The house was a museum of a marriage. Photos covered every surface. Thomas Chen in various stages of life, always with the same kind eyes and slight smile. Their daughter's graduation, anniversary celebrations. Travel pictures from places Marcus recognized from his own bucket list that would never happen now. Sarah moved through the space like a ghost haunting her own life, comfortable with grief the way you get comfortable with chronic pain. She made tea without asking if he wanted any. It gave them both something to do with their hands while they figured out how to talk about things neither wanted to say out loud. Marcus showed her his bill. She showed him hers. They spread the documents on her dining table next to a coffee mug that had clearly belonged to Thomas, positioned with the care of ritual. The bills were different, but the pattern matched. Both fraudulent, both targeting people the HOA assumed wouldn't fight. Sarah's for 4 years of sidewalk maintenance on a sidewalk that didn't exist. Marcus's for bridge maintenance on infrastructure he'd built himself, signed by the same HOA president, backed by the same threats of liens and foreclosure. Sarah spoke quietly, her words chosen with the precision of someone who'd spent years organizing information. Thomas had been treasurer for 3 years. He'd loved community service, believed in contributing, wanted to make Riverbend a better place. But in his final year, he'd found irregularities, money going to vendors that didn't exist, invoices for work never performed. When he'd asked for detailed accounting, he'd been stonewalled. When he'd pushed harder, they'd removed him from the board for unauthorized access to confidential records. He'd planned to take his findings to the county prosecutor, had an appointment scheduled. 2 days before the meeting, he'd had a fatal heart attack. 68 years old, no prior heart condition, sudden cardiac arrest. The autopsy said natural causes. Sarah had accepted it because what choice did a grieving widow have? But she'd always wondered, the timing, the threats he'd received in his final weeks, the way Patricia Thornhill had looked at her at the funeral, sympathy that felt more like warning. Marcus listened without interrupting. He understood the shape of her doubt, had his own about Linda's cancer. The doctor said they'd caught it too late, but he'd insisted she get checked when symptoms first appeared. They'd dismissed it as stress. By the time they took her seriously, it had spread too far. He'd never know if earlier treatment would have saved her. But the question haunted his sleep. What if, Sarah said, her voice barely above whisper, what if Thomas was right? What if they killed him? Before Marcus could answer, she stood and walked to a closet he hadn't noticed. When she opened it, he saw boxes, files, documents organized with the care of someone who understood how information could be weaponized. And on top, an envelope with her name and 4 words that made everything suddenly, terribly clear. If something happens, Sarah's hands shook as she held it. She hadn't opened this closet since the funeral, couldn't bear to face what Thomas might have left behind. But sitting across from this stranger who understood grief, who'd also lost someone he loved, who'd also been targeted by the same people who might have killed her husband, she found courage she'd thought died with Thomas. She broke the seal and pulled out pages covered in her husband's precise handwriting. Documentation of fraud spanning years. Shell companies, fake invoices, wire transfers to offshore accounts, names, dates, amounts, all meticulously recorded. A letter explaining what he'd found and why he feared for his safety. Instructions for what to do if he didn't survive to present it himself. And at the bottom, a flash drive labeled Complete Records. Marcus watched Sarah read her dead husband's warning and saw the moment grief transformed into something harder. Something that looked like the fury of a woman who'd spent 3 years believing she was crazy for suspecting murder. Who'd let people call her paranoid? Who'd stayed silent because speaking up meant accepting that the man she loved had been killed for doing the right thing. She looked up at Marcus with eyes that had stopped being fragile. You said we could make them believe together. What do we do? Marcus pulled out his phone and started making calls. First to a friend who did structural engineering for the county, who could verify the bridge was privately built and funded. Then to his cousin Mara, an attorney who specialized in civil fraud cases. Then to the sheriff's department to report the trespassing he suspected would happen once the HOA realized he wasn't paying quietly. While he worked, Sarah sat with Thomas's files spread before her like sacred texts. She'd been a research librarian for 42 years. She knew how to organize information, how to cross-reference sources, how to build cases that would stand up to scrutiny. The skills she'd thought retired with her came flooding back, sharp and ready. They worked through the afternoon and into evening, Marcus building the structural case with permits and surveys and engineering reports. Sarah building the financial case with Thomas's documentation and her own research into HOA records that were supposed to be public, but were conveniently difficult to access. They barely spoke except to confirm details and verify facts. 2 people who'd forgotten how to function in the world remembering how to fight. Around 7, someone knocked. Marcus tensed, but Sarah recognized the rhythm. She opened the door to find a woman about her age carrying a covered dish. Silver hair styled like armor, sharp eyes that missed nothing. Margaret Reynolds, retired teacher, neighborhood fixture, woman who knew everyone's business because she'd taught half the county's children over 40 years. She set the casserole down and looked at the papers covering every surface. Janet called me, Margaret said. Told me you 2 were finally doing something about Patricia. About time. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to have the spine. She settled into a chair without invitation and started talking. About other victims. Elderly residents threatened into paying fraudulent bills. Young families targeted when they were most vulnerable. A systematic pattern of predation. that had been going on for years, but that no one had been willing to fight collectively. Everyone thought they were alone. Everyone paid rather than risk their homes. But Margaret had been talking to people, quietly, carefully, building a network of residents who'd been victimized but were too scared to speak up. She'd been waiting for someone to be the first domino, the first person angry enough and evidence-backed enough to actually challenge Patricia's authority. "Looks like we found our dominoes," she said, gesturing at Marcus and Sarah. By 9 that night, Sarah's dining room had filled with people. Janet Kowalski with her paralegal expertise and garden gnome righteous anger. Grace Patterson from the bank with access to financial records that showed suspicious HOA deposits. Emma Rodriguez, young mother with a baby and a $5,000 bill for playground restoration on a playground that didn't exist, crying with relief that someone was finally fighting back. Frank Morrison, retired Army Corps of Engineers who'd done a comprehensive infrastructure report for the HOA 6 years ago that they'd buried because it exposed their neglect. Each person brought their piece of the puzzle. Each story added weight to the case building on Sarah's dining table. The HOA had been running a systematic fraud operation for years, targeting vulnerable residents, threatening anyone who asked questions, and covering their tracks by controlling access to records and intimidating potential witnesses. Marcus sat slightly outside the circle, watching these people who'd been isolated by fear find each other and transform into something stronger. This was what Linda had been good at: building community, connecting people, turning individual suffering into collective action. He'd always been the solitary one, more comfortable with structures than people. But maybe that's what they needed now. Someone who understood how to build things that wouldn't fall. Around midnight, they'd assembled enough evidence to take to authorities, enough witness statements to establish pattern, enough documentation to prove fraud. But Grace raised the question they'd all been avoiding. Patricia Thornhill had been HOA president for 7 years. She had connections. Her son worked in the county clerk's office. She knew people, had leverage, could make things difficult in ways that went beyond legal. "If we're doing this," Grace said, "we have to be ready for her to fight dirty. She won't just accept defeat. She'll come after us however she can." Marcus thought about his cameras, about the footage he knew would come eventually because people like Patricia always escalated, about Linda's voice telling him to care even when it hurt, about Sarah sitting across from him with her dead husband's files and 3 years of grief hardening into purpose. "Then we document everything," he said. "We protect each other. We assume she'll do the worst and prepare for it. And we don't back down." Sarah met his eyes across the table. She'd spent 3 years as a widow who'd lost her purpose along with her husband. In 6 hours, she'd become the center of a network of people ready to fight. She'd found Thomas's evidence and his courage and his belief that some things mattered enough to risk everything. She stood and raised the coffee mug that had been Thomas's. To doing the right thing, even when it costs us, even when it's hard, especially then. Everyone in the room raised their cups, coffee and tea and water in mismatched mugs held by people who'd been strangers that morning. A community born from crisis, held together by shared anger at injustice and shared determination to stop it. Marcus drove home after 1 a.m, exhausted but more alive than he'd felt since Linda died. He'd come to Riverbend to hide, to build one bridge and disappear into grief. Instead, he'd found people who needed what he could offer, purpose beyond his own pain. He checked his camera feeds before bed. Nothing yet. But it would come. Patricia would make a move. They always did when challenged. He'd be ready. The bridge stood solid in the moonlight, steel and wood, and the ghost of a dream his wife never got to see. He'd built it thinking it was an ending, a monument to what he'd lost. But maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the beginning of understanding that some bridges connect more than land. Some connect people who need each other, even when they don't know it yet. His phone buzzed with the text from Sarah. Simple and direct, the way she talked. "Thank you for knocking on my door. Thomas would have liked you." Marcus typed back before he could overthink it. "Linda would have liked you too. She was always better at this people stuff than me. Guess I'm learning." The response came quick. "We're all learning. That's the point." He set the phone down and looked at Linda's photo on his nightstand. The same one he carried in his wallet. The one he talked to on the bridge. the one that reminded him who he'd been when she was alive. A better version, more patient, more connected, more willing to care about things beyond his own comfort. "I've found something to fight for," he told her silent image. "Or maybe it found me. Either way, I'm in it now. Hope you're proud." The photo didn't answer. It never did. But Marcus felt something shift anyway. A weight he'd carried for 18 months getting slightly lighter. Not gone, never gone, but shared now with people who understood that grief and purpose could exist in the same space, that you could honor the dead by living fiercely for what they believed in. Sleep came easier than it had in months. 3 days later, at 3:47 in the morning, Marcus's phone lit up with a motion alert. He pulled up the camera feed and watched a dark sedan park near his bridge. Watched a man in a reflective vest and work gloves cross onto his property, carrying a post hole digger and a metal sign. Watched him install it at the bridge entrance with practiced efficiency. Watched him photograph it with his phone before driving away. The license plate was clearly visible in the infrared footage. Marcus ran it through the county tax database. Vehicle registered to Derek Thornhill, county clerk, Patricia's son. He took screenshots, backed up the footage to 3 separate cloud services, sent copies to Sarah, to Mara, his attorney cousin, to the group text thread that had formed between all the residents now working together. Then he got dressed and walked down to look at the sign in person. Professional quality, HOA logo, emergency access route designation, unauthorized use prohibited. All the official-looking language designed to make people think it was legitimate. Except it was planted on private property at 3 in the morning by a county employee acting on his mother's orders. Except Marcus had every second on video with timestamps and metadata that would hold up in court. Except they'd just handed him evidence of conspiracy, trespassing, and falsification of records. He left the sign where it was. Evidence was more valuable than satisfaction. By sunrise, Sarah had called an emergency meeting. By noon, they'd filed criminal complaints for trespassing, vandalism, and falsification of government documents. By evening, the sheriff's department had assigned Deputy Rachel Kowalski, Janet's niece, to investigate. Patricia Thornhill had made her first major mistake. She'd assumed Marcus would see the sign and either believe it was legitimate or be too intimidated to challenge it. She'd assumed no one would have cameras. She'd assumed she could manufacture authority the same way she'd been manufacturing bills. She'd assumed wrong. Deputy Kowalski reviewed the footage with an expression that got harder with each replay. "That's Derek Thornhill," she confirmed. "I know him from the county office. County employees shouldn't be involved in HOA enforcement activities. That's a conflict of interest at minimum. Could be worse depending on what else we find." She took Marcus's statement, photographed the sign in place, issued a case number, and promised to follow up within 48 hours. Before she left, she said something that made the hairs on Marcus's neck stand up. "We've had informal complaints about Riverbend HOA before. Nothing anyone would put in writing. People seemed scared, but if you're willing to go on record, Mr. Hayes, things might finally move." That night, the women's network that Margaret had been quietly building activated fully. Phone trees spread word. Victims who'd been silent started coming forward. Stories multiplied. Patterns emerged. The HOA hadn't just been committing fraud. They'd been running a systematic operation targeting the most vulnerable residents in the community. Emma Rodriguez's story was particularly damning. Young mother, first-time homeowner, charged $5,000 for playground restoration, while dealing with postpartum depression and a newborn. She'd paid because she was too exhausted to fight, and too scared of losing her home. The playground they claimed to restore had been torn down years before she moved in. Frank Morrison revealed that his infrastructure report from 6 years ago had documented real maintenance needs the HOA ignored while inventing fake projects to justify bills. Roads that needed repair, drainage systems that needed upgrades, a community well that needed modernization. All necessary work left undone while Patricia collected money for phantom projects. Grace Patterson from the bank quietly pulled records showing Patricia's personal accounts had received regular cash deposits totaling over $150,000 in 3 years. No declared income source. No legitimate explanation. The case built itself, layer after layer of evidence, victim after victim finding courage to speak, a community that had been fractured by fear knitting itself back together through shared anger and shared determination. Sarah coordinated it all from her dining room. Thomas's files spread before her like battle plans, his photo watching over the work he'd started and died for. She'd found her purpose in finishing what he began. More than that, she'd found family in these people who'd been strangers a week ago. Margaret with her sharp wit and organizational genius, Janet with her legal knowledge and fierce protective instincts, Emma who needed mothering and gave Sarah reason to nurture again, Grace who worked quietly but effectively behind the scenes, and Marcus, the grief-broken engineer who'd knocked on her door and changed everything, who understood loss the way only someone who'd survived it could, who brought technical competence and stubborn determination, and a willingness to build structures that wouldn't fall even when everything else did. They worked together like people who'd known each other for years instead of days, united by purpose and pain and the growing realization that they were actually going to win this. 2 weeks after Derek installed the sign, the state attorney general's office contacted Marcus. They'd been tracking HOA fraud cases statewide, and his documentation was the most comprehensive they'd seen. Would he be willing to cooperate with a broader investigation? Marcus called Sarah before answering. They made decisions together now, partners in this fight that had become bigger than either of them anticipated. Sarah didn't hesitate. Thomas died trying to expose this. If we can help stop it from happening to others, we have to. Marcus agreed, and the machinery of state justice began to turn. Subpoenas, forensic accountants, investigators with authority that went beyond local politics and county connections. The kind of pressure that Patricia Thornhill's influence couldn't deflect. But victory still felt distant. Patricia had resources, connections, a son who could manipulate county records. She wasn't going down without a fight, and people who'd killed once to protect their fraud might be willing to kill again. The threat started small: anonymous letters, hang-up phone calls, cars driving slowly past houses at odd hours, Margaret's garden gnome smashed, Emma's mailbox spray-painted, Frank's truck tires slashed. They documented everything, reported everything, protected each other with watch schedules and security cameras and group text threads that stayed active around the clock. The community they'd built became their shield. Sarah found herself surrounded by people again after 3 years of isolation. Her house filled with voices and purpose and the sound of dishes being washed and coffee being made and plans being hatched. She felt Thomas's presence in it, the community he'd believed in finally manifesting, the work he'd died for bearing fruit through people who refused to let his death be meaningless. Late one night after everyone had left and the house fell quiet again, Sarah sat with his photo and his journal and the letter he'd written knowing he might not survive to see justice done. "We did it," she told him. "We found the courage you had. We're finishing what you started. I hope wherever you are, you can see this. You can see me standing up instead of shrinking, fighting instead of hiding, living again instead of just existing." The coffee mug sat in its usual place, but it didn't feel like shrine anymore. It felt like reminder of love that persisted, of purpose that transcended death, of battles worth fighting even when the cost was everything. Sarah turned off the lights and went to bed feeling something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Not that grief would end or that Thomas would come back or that life would return to what it was, but hope that tomorrow mattered, that she mattered, that the work they were doing would protect people who came after them. Hope that some bridges, once built, carried weight beyond what anyone imagined when the first beam was set. The war room took shape in Margaret Reynolds' dining room because hers was bigger, and she didn't mind the chaos. By the 3rd day after Derek's midnight sign installation, the table had disappeared under layers of documents, each one a piece of the puzzle they were assembling. Color-coded folders lined the walls, Margaret's teacher brain-organizing chaos into something navigable. Sarah handled historical records and Thomas's files. Janet managed legal documents and procedures. Grace coordinated financial analysis with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years making numbers, tell stories banks didn't want heard. Marcus stood at the edge of it all, watching these women work with a precision his engineering firm had never achieved. No ego battles over credit. No territorial disputes about who controlled what information. When someone made a mistake, it got corrected without blame. When someone had expertise, everyone else deferred without resentment. Emma, the youngest at 29, taught Sarah how to create spreadsheets that cross-reference data automatically. Sarah taught Emma research methodology that turned Google searches into investigative tools. Margaret caught him watching and smiled. "You look confused," she said. Marcus shook his head, impressed. "I've managed teams of 40 engineers, never seen anything run this smoothly." "That's because we actually listen to each other," Margaret replied. "Novel concept in the business world, I know." The pattern was becoming clear. Riverbend Estates, HOA, had been running a systematic fraud operation for at least 6 years, possibly longer. They targeted specific demographics with surgical precision. Elderly residents on fixed incomes who wouldn't have resources to fight back. Young families with new mortgages and babies who couldn't afford legal battles. Single parents stretched too thin to add another battle to their daily survival. Anyone who looked vulnerable became prey. The amounts varied, but the methodology stayed consistent. Invent a community project that sounded plausible. Generate official-looking invoices. Bill residents with threats of liens and foreclosure. Collect the money into HOA accounts. Transfer it to shell companies that existed only on paper. Then move it into personal accounts belonging to Patricia Thornhill and Gerald Masterson, the HOA vice president who'd held his position for 6 years, without anyone questioning why. Grace Patterson had the financial records spread across one end of the table, her banker's eye catching patterns that would slip past most people. She'd pulled HOA budget reports going back 8 years, cross-referenced them with county business registrations, and found companies that didn't exist anywhere except on invoices. Riverbend Landscaping Solutions, Mountain Infrastructure Consulting, Watershed Management Associates. Professional names backed by nothing except Patricia's signature authorizing payment. But the real smoking gun was Gerald Masterson's personal banking records. Grace had access through her position at the bank, though she was careful about what she could legally share and what crossed lines that would make the evidence unusable in court. What she could confirm was that Gerald had been making regular large deposits to offshore gambling sites, $140,000 over 3 years, money that appeared in his accounts right after HOA transfers to those phantom companies. The problem was proving Patricia's direct involvement beyond her signature on approvals. They needed someone inside the operation, someone who knew how the money moved and where the bodies were buried, someone willing to testify. That someone walked through Margaret's door on a Thursday afternoon carrying a casserole dish and wearing the haunted expression of a woman who'd stopped sleeping weeks ago. Rita Masterson looked like every corporate wife Marcus had ever met. Perfectly styled silver hair that probably cost more to maintain than most people's car payments. Expensive but understated clothes that whispered old money, even though Marcus knew from Grace's research that the Mastersons had been middle class until the HOA money started flowing. Makeup applied with the skill of someone who'd spent decades hiding exhaustion behind foundation and concealer. But nothing could hide the tremor in her hands when she set the casserole dish down on Margaret's counter. She was 59 years old and looked every day of it despite the expensive maintenance. Married to Gerald for 35 years. Raised 2 sons who'd moved away and rarely called. Retired from pharmacy work 10 years ago to take care of Gerald's aging mother, who'd died 3 years back. The kind of woman who'd sacrificed her own ambitions to support her husband's career and raise his children and care for his family, only to discover that sacrifice hadn't earned the security she'd been promised. Margaret had invited her to what she called a book club meeting, which everyone knew was code for the resistance gathering that happened daily in this dining room. Rita had hesitated. Book clubs were safe. Whatever this really was felt dangerous. But Margaret had been her friend for 20 years, since their sons played Little League together. If Margaret said to come, Rita came. Now she stood frozen in the doorway between kitchen and dining room, staring at the documents spread across the table like evidence at a crime scene. Her husband's name appeared on at least 20 pages currently visible. Invoices with his signature. Bank statements with his account numbers. Email printouts with his name in the sender line. She went pale, reaching for the doorframe to steady herself. Margaret moved to her side with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 40 years managing classroom crises. Gentle but firm. "Rita, honey, sit down before you fall down. You're safe here." "I shouldn't have come," Rita whispered. Her voice came out thin, stretched across fear like wire ready to snap. Gerald doesn't know I'm here. If he finds out I've been talking about him, if he knows I went through his files, he won't find out from us, Sarah said quietly. She'd moved to Rita's other side without seeming to rush. We protect our own. And you're one of us now, whether you knew it or not. I'm not one of anything, Rita said, but she let them guide her to a chair. I'm just a retired pharmacist who made bad choices about who to trust. Rita sank into a chair and stared at the evidence of her husband's crimes laid out like an autopsy. She started talking, and once she began, the words tumbled out faster than she could organize them. 3 years of suspicion, money disappearing from their retirement accounts, Gerald claiming it was investments, market fluctuations, nothing to worry about. But Rita had been a pharmacist for 30 years before she retired. She understood numbers and chemistry, and when things didn't add up to what they should. She'd found bank statements Gerald thought he'd hidden, transfers to offshore gambling sites, sports betting, online poker, losses that would have destroyed most families. The 140,000 Grace had traced was just what Rita had found. There was probably more in accounts she didn't know about. I confronted him last month, Rita said. He told me to stay out of it, said he had it under control. But I see him at night, staring at his laptop, hands shaking the same way mine are now. He's in deeper than he'll admit. And I think Patricia is helping him cover it up. She looked at Sarah directly. I know your husband was treasurer. I know he died asking questions about where money was going. Gerald came home the night after Thomas's funeral and got drunk. Really drunk. He kept saying it wasn't supposed to happen that way, that Patricia went too far. The room went silent. Marcus watched Sarah's face go through shock, grief, validation, and rage in the space of 3 heartbeats. What else did he say? Sarah's voice came out steady despite the tears starting to track down her face. Rita's voice dropped to barely above whisper. He said Thomas wouldn't let it go, that he had evidence, that Patricia said she'd handle it. Then a week later, Thomas was dead, and Gerald stopped sleeping through the night. He won't talk about it sober, but drunk, he can't stop the guilt from leaking out. Margaret spoke into the silence that followed. Rita, what you're telling us could mean your husband goes to prison. Are you sure you want to do this? Rita's laugh came out broken. I don't know who I'm married to anymore. The man I loved wouldn't have stolen from neighbors, wouldn't have gambled away our retirement, wouldn't have been involved in someone's death. That man is gone, if he ever really existed. What's left is a stranger I'm terrified of. Lisa Chen, the social worker who joined their group 3 days ago, moved to sit beside Rita. You don't have to decide everything right now, but you should know that what you're describing is financial abuse. Gambling addiction destroys families, and if he's involved in covering up a death, you could be in danger too. I know, Rita said. That's why I'm here. I need help. And if helping means giving you what you need to stop him and Patricia, then that's what I'm going to do. She reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. Gerald's laptop passwords, access to his home office files, bank account numbers, everything I could copy without him noticing. I don't know what's on here. I was too scared to look, but it's yours now. Grace took the flash drive like it was made of glass. Rita, this is incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. Where are you staying? Rita blinked. What do you mean? You can't go home, Janet said firmly. Not if you just stole evidence from a man who might be involved in murder. You need to be somewhere safe. I don't have anywhere, Rita said, her voice small. Yes, you do, Margaret replied. You're staying with me. Guest room is already made up. We'll get your things tomorrow when Gerald's at work. Tonight, you're safe. Rita broke down then. Not quiet tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes when a facade held together by willpower finally cracks. Sarah moved to hold her, this woman she barely knew, this wife of the man who might have helped kill Thomas. They sat together while Rita cried out 35 years of denial and 3 years of mounting horror at what her husband had become. Emma Rodriguez watched from across the room, her 8-month-old daughter sleeping in a carrier against her chest. She'd been the youngest person in this resistance movement, joining because Margaret had reached out after Emma paid that fraudulent playground bill. She'd felt isolated and overwhelmed by new motherhood and postpartum depression that made every day feel like climbing mountains in lead shoes. The HOA bill had felt like an attack when she was most vulnerable. But watching these older women rally around Rita, watching them create safety and support and refusal to let anyone face danger alone, Emma felt something shift. These women were teaching her what strength looked like at every age. Margaret at 71, organizing resistance with the same precision she'd used to run classrooms for 40 years. Sarah at 73, channeling grief into purpose. Janet at 68, bringing legal expertise and fierce protection. Grace at 58, wielding financial knowledge like a weapon. Rita at 59, finding courage to walk away from a marriage that had become a cage. They were showing Emma who she could become if she refused to let fear win. They were building the support network she desperately needed and didn't know how to ask for. And they were doing it while dismantling a criminal operation that had preyed on people exactly like her. That night, while Rita settled into Margaret's guest room, and the women dispersed to their homes with assignments for the next day's research, Marcus helped Sarah organize the files they'd accumulated. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. Sarah finally spoke. Thomas used to talk about community, real community, not just people who happen to live near each other. He said it was built in crisis, when people had to choose between helping each other or protecting themselves. Marcus nodded. Linda said something similar. She believed people were fundamentally good but fundamentally scared, that most of us spend our lives in the gap between those two truths. Sarah smiled. I think they would have liked each other, our spouses. They would have been insufferable together, Marcus agreed. Organizing dinner parties and book clubs and dragging us to social events we'd try to engineer our way out of. They shared the kind of laugh that grief allowed sometimes. Bittersweet, but real. The flash drive Rita had provided turned out to be a goldmine. Chen, the accountant who joined their group, spent 12 hours going through the files with Grace looking over her shoulder. What they found was meticulous documentation of Gerald's descent into gambling addiction and Patricia's exploitation of it. Spreadsheets showing gambling losses dating back 5 years. Email chains between Gerald and Patricia discussing how to cover the shortfalls. Invoices for the phantom companies with notes in Gerald's handwriting showing which HOA accounts to draw from. Wire transfer confirmations showing money moving from HOA funds to shell companies to Gerald's personal accounts to offshore gambling sites. But the most damning evidence was a series of text messages between Patricia and Gerald from 3 years ago. 2 weeks before Chen died, Gerald had texted Patricia that Thomas was requesting complete financial records going back 5 years. Patricia's response was chilling in its brevity. I'll handle it. 1 week later, Gerald texted asking what she meant by handle it. Patricia's reply, some problems solve themselves. Others need help. I'm helping. The day after Thomas died, Gerald sent a message at 3 in the morning. This is wrong. We went too far. Patricia's response came an hour later. What's done is done. Stay quiet or we both go down. Your choice. Carol and Grace brought the evidence to the full group the next morning. Emma had to leave the room, holding her baby, when they read the messages aloud. The implications were too terrible. Rita sat silent, her face a mask, processing that the man she'd been married to for 35 years had been party to murder. Sarah was the calmest person in the room. She'd suspected for 3 years. Having it confirmed hurt, but also validated every instinct she'd suppressed, because people told her she was seeing conspiracies and grief. Now she had proof. Now the work was getting justice. Marcus contacted Agent Lisa Warren at the State Attorney General's office. She'd been assigned to their case 3 days ago and had already requested preliminary documentation. When he told her they had evidence suggesting the fraud was connected to a suspicious death 3 years prior, her tone shifted from professional to urgent. I need to see everything, she said. And we need to talk about exhumation. The word hung in the air like a weight. Sarah had known it might come to this. The original autopsy on Thomas had listed cause of death as cardiac arrest, natural causes. But that was before anyone suspected foul play, before they had evidence of motive and conspiracy, before Rita's testimony about Patricia having access to pharmaceutical-grade medications through her. Rita had mentioned it almost casually during one of their long conversations. Patricia had visited the week before Thomas died. She'd been alone in Rita's home office for 20 minutes while Rita made tea, the office where Rita kept her old pharmacy samples in a locked cabinet. Except the cabinet hadn't been locked that day because Rita had been organizing supplies. When Agent Warren asked what medications Rita had in that cabinet, her answer made everyone stop breathing. Digoxin, used to treat heart conditions, carefully controlled because excessive doses could cause cardiac arrest that looked exactly like a natural heart attack. Rita had kept samples for years, a habit from her pharmacy days, though she'd never thought about them being dangerous. Until now. Until she remembered Patricia alone in that office. Until she put together the timeline and realized that a week after Patricia's visit, Thomas Chen had died of sudden cardiac arrest with no prior heart condition. The exhumation would require Sarah's permission and her daughter Amanda's agreement. It would mean disturbing Thomas's rest, opening wounds that had barely started to scar. But it might also mean proving he was murdered and holding his killers accountable. Sarah sat in front of Thomas's grave for 2 hours before making the decision. Maybe longer. Time moved strangely in cemeteries, measured in memory rather than minutes. The cemetery was quiet, except for wind through the pines and the distant sound of the creek that ran behind the property. Same creek that eventually fed the stream Marcus's bridge crossed. Everything in Riverbend connected to everything else if you followed the water long enough. She talked to Thomas like she had when he was alive, asking questions she'd never get answers to, but that needed asking anyway. Her voice carried on the wind, words for a man 3 years gone. Do I disturb your peace for justice? Do I put us both through this again because the first investigation got it wrong? Would you want this? Would you want me to let strangers dig you up and examine you like evidence instead of a man I loved? Or would you tell me to let you rest and move forward with whatever life I have left? The headstone offered no answers, just his name, his dates, and the epitaph she'd chosen through fog of grief. Beloved husband and father, man of integrity. Those words felt heavier now. Integrity had killed him. Doing the right thing had cost him everything. But integrity was also why she couldn't let his murder go unpunished. Why she couldn't accept the comfortable lie of natural causes when evidence pointed to poison. Thomas had spent his last weeks documenting fraud even when it put him in danger. He'd known the risk and chosen truth anyway. She owed him the same courage. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the gravesite. Sarah chose to interpret it as answer, the way widows did when they needed permission from ghosts to keep living. Thomas would want the truth known, would want his death to mean something beyond senseless loss, would want Patricia Thornhill held accountable for every life she'd damaged and the one she'd taken. Sarah stood on joints that protested the movement. 73 years of living settling into bones that remembered more flexible days. She placed her hand on the headstone one more time, cold marble under her palm despite afternoon sun. I'm going to do this, Thomas. Going to let them disturb you one more time. I'm sorry, so sorry, but I need to know for certain. Need to prove what I've suspected for 3 years. You deserve justice, we all do. She walked back to her car with decision made, but heart still heavy. Some choices were right without being easy. Some necessities felt like violations, even when they were the only path forward. Amanda flew in from California the next day. She was 42, successful in her career, struggling in her marriage, and looking more like Sarah every time they saw each other. The grief had hit her differently. She'd thrown herself into work, avoiding the pain through constant motion. Coming home meant confronting what she'd spent 3 years running from. Mother and daughter sat in Sarah's kitchen, the same kitchen where Thomas had made terrible pancakes every Sunday morning for 40 years. The same kitchen where Sarah had found him slumped over the table that terrible morning, already gone. The papers he'd been reviewing scattered across the floor. Amanda held her mother's hand across the table. Are you sure about this, Mom? No, Sarah admitted, but I'm sure about needing to know the truth. Your father deserves that. We all do. What if it's worse than not knowing? It usually is. But I can't spend the rest of my life wondering. Can't keep setting out his coffee mug every morning while pretending I don't suspect he was murdered. Either I know for certain, or I drive myself crazy with uncertainty. Amanda nodded. Then we do it together. You don't go through this alone. The court approved the exhumation based on new evidence suggesting foul play. The process would take 3 weeks. In the meantime, the investigation into the HOA fraud accelerated with the momentum of a boulder rolling downhill. Derek Thornhill was cracking in the way dams crack before they fail catastrophically. Marcus could see it every time he went to the county clerk's office to file public records requests, which he did more often than strictly necessary, because he wanted Derek to see him, wanted him to be reminded daily of what he'd done and who he'd hurt. Derek's hands shook when he processed the documents, fingers fumbling over keyboard keys he'd typed on for 6 years without error. His eyes were hollow with lack of sleep, ringed dark enough that makeup couldn't hide it. He'd lost maybe 20 pounds in 3 weeks, his county uniform hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be collapsing inward. He'd started jumping at unexpected sounds, dropped things, apologized constantly for minor infractions that didn't require apology. The other clerks had stopped trying to make conversation with him. He radiated misery like heat from asphalt in summer, impossible to ignore and uncomfortable to stand near. Marcus had seen that look before. Young engineers who'd made mistakes that compromised structural integrity, living with the knowledge that their error might kill someone when the building finally failed. The weight of potential harm was crushing enough. Derek carried the weight of actual harm. His falsification of records had enabled his mother's fraud for years. His midnight installation of that sign had been caught on camera and reported to the sheriff. He'd helped hurt people he'd grown up with, people whose kids he'd coached in Little League, families he saw at the grocery store and church and community events. And now, evidence suggested his mother might have killed someone, might have murdered Thomas Chen for threatening to expose fraud that Derek had helped conceal. The guilt wasn't just eating him alive, it was devouring him from inside out, leaving nothing but shell walking through motions of living. One afternoon, Marcus engineered a confrontation, waited until Derek was alone in the records room, then walked in with a simple records request. Derek processed it mechanically, avoiding eye contact. "Your father was a good man," Marcus said quietly. "I've heard stories. How he coached, how he volunteered, how he loved this community." Derek's hands froze on the keyboard. "He died 5 years ago," Marcus continued. "Cancer. Medical bills that nearly destroyed your family financially. I know what that's like. Linda's treatment cost us everything we'd saved. Sometimes desperation makes people do things they never imagined they were capable of." Derek looked up, eyes wet. "What do you want from me?" "Truth," Marcus said. "That's all. The truth about what you did, what your mother did, what really happened to Thomas Chen. You can't carry this alone. It'll destroy you." "My mother is going to prison," Marcus finished. "With or without your testimony, the evidence is overwhelming. The only question is whether you go down with her or whether you choose to do the right thing now, even though it's late." Derek's face crumpled. "He's haunted me every day since I installed that sign. Thomas Chen. I didn't know her then, what she'd done to him. I just thought I was helping my mom with HOA business. Then I found out, found the messages, found evidence of what she really was. And I didn't know how to stop it without destroying my family." "Your family is already destroyed," Marcus said, not unkindly. "Your father is gone. Your mother is a criminal. The only family you have left is the one you choose, the community you decide to protect or betray. Your father would want you to protect it, you know that." Derek put his head in his hands and sobbed. Marcus stood there, uncomfortable with other people's emotions, the way engineers often were, but refusing to leave. Sometimes witnessing was enough. Sometimes just not being alone made the difference. 2 days later, Derek contacted Agent Warren. He brought every document he'd falsified, every email his mother had sent him, every record of their conspiracy. He offered full cooperation in exchange for the prosecution considering his remorse and assistance when it came time for sentencing. The dominoes were falling faster now. Derek's testimony provided the final links in the chain connecting Patricia to the fraud. Rita's evidence showed the gambling connection and Gerald's involvement. Sarah's documentation from Thomas established pattern and motive. Marcus's footage proved recent criminal activity. The state's forensic accountants traced every dollar from HOA accounts to shell companies to personal use. But they still needed proof of murder. That would require the exhumation results. 3 weeks felt like 3 years. Sarah threw herself into community organizing, helping Emma set up a support group for young mothers dealing with postpartum depression, helping Rita file for divorce and find an apartment, helping Margaret coordinate testimony from the dozens of residents now coming forward with stories of HOA abuse. The Women's Network had become something larger than fraud investigation. It was mutual aid and collective care, and the kind of community Thomas had believed in building. Older women mentoring younger women teaching new skills to elders, everyone contributing according to their abilities and receiving according to their needs. Emma thrived under the attention and support. The postpartum depression that had made every day a battle started lifting as she spent more time surrounded by women who understood struggle and survival. Her daughter, Hope, became the unofficial mascot of the resistance, passed from grandmother to grandmother, while Emma worked on coordinating social media documentation of the fraud case. Marcus watched it all and learned. He'd spent his career in male-dominated engineering firms, where collaboration meant competition and vulnerability meant weakness. This was different. These women shared credit and acknowledged mistakes and built each other up instead of tearing each other down. They were teaching him a different model of strength, one that included asking for help and accepting support, and admitting when you didn't have all the answers. Patricia's counterattack came hard and personal. Anonymous letters arrived at Sarah's house claiming she was mentally unstable, inventing conspiracies about her husband's death because she couldn't accept natural causes. Letters to Emma suggesting that fighting the HOA would put her baby in danger. Margaret's garden got vandalized again, this time with spray paint spelling out threats across her garage door. But the intimidation tactics that might have worked when everyone fought alone failed against organized resistance. Every threat got documented, photographed, reported to the sheriff. Every attempt to isolate someone got met with increased community support. When Emma received threatening letters, 5 women showed up at her house unannounced with dinner, babysitting, and the simple message that she wasn't alone. The network held. Deputy Rachel Kowalski, Janet's niece, and their ally in the sheriff's department started spending more time at Margaret's house. Officially, she was following up on the various vandalism and intimidation reports. Unofficially, she was documenting a pattern of witness tampering that would add charges to Patricia's eventual indictment. The exhumation results came back on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Patel, the medical examiner who'd reviewed the case, called Sarah personally rather than sending a report through official channels. His voice carried the weight of delivering news no one wanted to hear. "Mrs. Chen, I need to meet with you in person. Can you come to my office this afternoon? And bring support. You're going to need it." Sarah called Amanda, Marcus, and Margaret. They met at Dr. Patel's office at 2 p.m., sitting in chairs designed for bad news while he explained what the new toxicology tests had found. Digoxin poisoning, pharmaceutical grade, administered 12 to 24 hours before death. The levels were 4 times therapeutic dose. Your husband had no prescription for digoxin. He had no heart condition requiring it. Someone gave this to him deliberately. The original autopsy didn't test for it because there was no reason to suspect poisoning. But with the new context, it's conclusive. Thomas Chen was murdered. Sarah didn't cry. She'd used up her tears over 3 years. What she felt was cold validation. She'd known. Her gut had screamed it even when her brain tried to accept the official story. Thomas had been killed for threatening to expose fraud. Killed and made to look like natural causes so no one would investigate. And she'd let them get away with it for 3 years because she'd been too broken by grief to trust her own instincts. Amanda held her mother's hand while Dr. Patel explained the next steps. The case was now officially a homicide investigation. The state police would take over from the sheriff's department. Patricia Thornhill would be arrested on murder charges. Gerald Masterson would be charged as an accessory. Derek's cooperation might spare him the worst charges, but he'd still face consequences for his role in the cover-up. Marcus asked the technical questions Sarah couldn't formulate through the fog of vindication and rage. How certain was the evidence? Would it hold up in court? What was the timeline for arrests? Dr. Patel answered with the precision of someone who testified in hundreds of cases. The evidence was ironclad. The timeline showed clear motive and opportunity. Rita's testimony about the missing digoxin samples would establish means. The text messages between Patricia and Gerald would establish conspiracy. They had everything needed for conviction. That evening, the women gathered at Sarah's house one more time before everything changed. Before the arrests and the media attention, and the public nature of what had been private grief for so long. They sat in her living room, the same room where Thomas had read to their daughter when she was young, where they'd celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays that seemed precious only in hindsight. Sarah looked at each face. Margaret, who'd organized them into an army, Janet, who'd provided legal framework, Grace, who'd followed the money, Rita, who'd sacrificed her marriage for truth, Emma, who'd found courage despite overwhelming fear, Amanda, who'd come home to support her mother through the unimaginable, and Marcus, the grief-broken engineer who'd started all this by refusing to pay a fraudulent bill for a bridge he'd built with his own hands. "We did it," Sarah said simply. "We got justice for Thomas, for everyone Patricia hurt, for ourselves." Margaret raised her glass of wine. "To Thomas Chen, who started this fight and gave us the tools to finish it." Everyone drank. Rita spoke next, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "To second chances, to finding family when blood fails you. To women who refuse to be silent." More glasses raised. Emma stood, holding hope, tears streaming down her face. "To the mothers and grandmothers who taught me what courage looks like. My daughter will grow up knowing this story, knowing that ordinary people can fight back and win." The room dissolved into emotion then. Hugs and tears and the kind of catharsis that comes when long battles reach their end. Marcus stood slightly apart, witness to this moment of feminine solidarity and strength, humbled by what these women had built from rage and grief and refusal to accept injustice. His phone rang. "Agent Warren, Mr. Hayes, we're executing arrest warrants for Patricia Thornhill and Gerald Masterson at 6 a.m. tomorrow. I wanted you and Mrs. Chen to know before it hits the news. This is going to be public. Media attention. Probably significant. Are you both ready for that?" Marcus looked at Sarah, who nodded. "We're ready," he said. "We've been ready for 3 years." The arrests happened at dawn. Patricia in her expensive home, Gerald at his office, both taken in handcuffs while news cameras rolled. By 8 a.m., every local station was covering the story. By noon, it had gone statewide. HOA president and vice president arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and murder of former treasurer who'd tried to expose them. The community of Riverbend Estates woke up to find their private nightmare had become public knowledge. Some residents were horrified by the attention. Others were relieved that the truth was finally visible. Many were stunned to learn the scope of what had been happening in their own neighborhood. But the women who'd built the resistance movement were ready. They'd prepared statements, organized support for victims who wanted to come forward, created systems for handling media requests and public attention. What could have been chaos became coordinated response because Margaret had planned for every contingency. That night, 70 residents packed into the community center for an emergency town hall meeting. The building was designed to hold maybe 50 comfortably. People stood along the walls, sat in windowsills, crowded the doorways, straining to hear. The parking lot overflowed into the street beyond. This wasn't just the usual suspects who attended every HOA meeting to complain about property lines and tree trimming. This was the entire community waking up to what had been happening in their collective backyard. Mayor Gregson presided from the small stage at the front, looking grim in the way politicians did when they realized a problem they'd ignored had metastasized into crisis. The county attorney sat beside him, a woman named Jennifer Torres, who specialized in municipal law, and had the exhausted expression of someone who'd been working 70-hour weeks trying to untangle the legal mess. She'd be the one explaining the process ahead, the timeline for prosecution, the civil remedies available to victims. But the real story wasn't on stage. It was in the audience. Neighbors who'd been isolated by fear and shame finding each other for the first time. Victims who'd thought they were alone discovering dozens of others with similar stories. Elderly residents realizing they weren't the only ones threatened with liens. Young families understanding their targeting wasn't random bad luck, but systematic predation. The collective recognition transformed individual grievances into shared outrage. Marcus stood to speak when called on, but kept it brief. His engineer's brain didn't do well with emotional speeches or dramatic gestures. His part in this had been technical, building the case through documentation and evidence, and the kind of methodical investigation that turned suspicions into proof. The real work, the work that mattered most, had been done by women who'd built community from ashes of betrayal. Sarah spoke longer when her turn came. About Thomas. About the kind of man who spent his last weeks documenting fraud instead of enjoying retirement. About the price he'd paid for integrity. About the importance of finishing what he'd begun. about the choice between fear and courage, between silence and truth, between protecting yourself and protecting your neighbors. Her voice never wavered. She'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment without knowing it. Everything she'd survived. Every morning she'd woken up and chosen to keep breathing despite the weight. Every coffee mug set out in memorial ritual. All of it had led here, to standing in front of her community and transforming private grief into public purpose. When she finished, the room erupted in applause that started scattered and built like avalanche. Not polite acknowledgement, but standing ovation that went on for minutes. Wave after wave of sound that was really gratitude and recognition and collective catharsis. Recognition of courage and sacrifice and the refusal to let murder be forgotten or fraud go unpunished. Rita spoke briefly when the applause finally died, admitted her husband's crimes in voice that shook but didn't break, apologized for not seeing sooner, though Margaret had told her repeatedly that she was victim, not accomplice, pledged to testify fully and help the prosecution in any way possible. The room stayed respectfully silent while she spoke, understanding what it cost to stand up and claim responsibility for proximity to evil, even when you hadn't participated in it. Emma stood with hope in her arms, the baby wide awake and looking around at all the faces with infant curiosity that didn't yet understand anger or justice or any of the complicated emotions saturating the room. Emma thanked the older women who'd saved her when she was drowning in postpartum depression and HOA threats, and the overwhelming isolation of new motherhood in a place where she knew no one. Promised to pass on that same support to the next generation. Her testimony carried weight because she represented everyone who'd been targeted at their most vulnerable. Young families who just stretched finances to breaking point, buying first homes. New parents terrified of losing shelter for their children. People just trying to survive who became prey for predators who saw vulnerability as opportunity. The meeting ran 4 hours. By the end, the community had voted to immediately suspend all HOA enforcement activities pending investigation, to demand full financial audit going back 10 years, to create oversight committee ensuring no future board could operate in darkness, to rebuild from foundation up, with transparency and accountability as bedrock principles. Marcus drove Sarah home after midnight. They were both exhausted, both emotionally wrung out, both strangely at peace. Thomas would be proud, Marcus said. Sarah nodded. So would Linda. This is what she meant about caring even when it hurts. They sat in his truck outside her house for a moment, neither ready to move yet. What happens now? Marcus asked. Now we prepare for trial, Sarah said. We support Rita and Derek through what comes next. We help Emma and the other young families rebuild their sense of safety. We make sure Thomas's death meant something. And after that? Sarah smiled. After that, we live. Really live, not just survive. That's what they'd want. Both of them. Marcus nodded. Sounded like a plan. Sounded like Linda's kind of plan, actually. Sarah got out of the truck but paused before closing the door. Marcus, thank you for knocking on my door that day, for building a bridge that brought us all together. I think the bridge was always there, Marcus replied. We just had to find each other to cross it. Sarah went inside to a house that no longer felt like a tomb. Amanda was waiting up, making tea the way her father used to. Mother and daughter sat at the kitchen table, Thomas's coffee mug in its usual spot, but somehow less like shrine now. More like reminder of love that persisted past death, of purpose that transcended loss, of bridges that connected hearts across the impossible distance between living and gone. Tomorrow would bring more battles, trial preparation, media attention, the long, slow grind of justice through legal system. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that truth had won, that community had proven stronger than corruption, that ordinary people refusing to be silent could change everything. Sarah touched the coffee mug one more time before heading to bed. We did it, Thomas. We finished what you started. You can rest now. We all can. The toxicology report arrived on Sarah's doorstep in an envelope that felt heavier than its weight in paper. Dr. Patel had called ahead, warned her what was coming, but reading it in black and white made the abstract concrete. Digoxin, pharmaceutical grade, 4 times therapeutic dose, administered 12 to 24 hours before death. Thomas Chen had been murdered, and someone had spent 3 years hoping no one would look closely enough to find out. Sarah sat at her kitchen table with the report spread before her, Amanda's hand covering hers, Marcus standing quietly by the window giving them space, but refusing to leave them alone with the news. The coffee mug that had been Thomas's sat in its usual spot, but for the first time in 3 years, it felt less like shrine and more like witness. He'd known something was wrong, had documented everything, had left instructions in case he didn't survive. He'd been right, and she'd spent 3 years being told she was paranoid for trusting her instincts. The validation hurt worse than the doubt ever had. Agent Lisa Warren arrived within the hour, bringing with her the full weight of the state's investigative apparatus. She was 48, looked younger, carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent 2 decades putting criminals away, and had no patience for people who thought they were above the law. She sat across from Sarah and Amanda and laid out what happened next with the kind of directness Marcus appreciated. No sugarcoating, no false comfort, just facts delivered by someone who respected their intelligence enough to tell them the truth. The case was now officially a homicide investigation. State police would take over from the county sheriff's department, though Deputy Kowalski would remain involved as liaison. Patricia Thornhill would be arrested on murder charges along with fraud, embezzlement, and a list of other crimes long enough to guarantee she'd die in prison if convicted. Gerald Masterson would be charged as accessory to murder based on the text messages showing he knew what Patricia planned and did nothing to stop it. Derek's cooperation had earned him consideration, but he'd still face charges for his role in falsifying records and enabling the conspiracy. The evidence was strong enough that Agent Warren felt comfortable saying conviction was likely. The digoxin poisoning was conclusive. Rita's testimony about the missing medication would establish means. The text messages would establish conspiracy and motive. Thomas's own documentation would show why they needed him dead. Add in the financial fraud proven by months of investigation, the pattern of targeting vulnerable residents, the systematic nature of the operation. And you had a case that would be hard for any defense attorney to crack. But strong wasn't the same as guaranteed. Patricia had resources, connections, 7 years of building relationships with people who owed her favors. She'd hire the best criminal defense attorney money could buy, and that attorney would try every trick in the book to create reasonable doubt. They'd attack Sarah's credibility, suggest she was a grief-stricken widow seeing conspiracies where none existed. They'd question the toxicology despite its scientific certainty. They'd paint Thomas as paranoid, his investigation as amateur-hour detective work by someone with no real expertise. The prosecution would need witnesses willing to testify, victims willing to go public with their stories, technical experts who could explain complex financial fraud to a jury of regular people who might not understand shell companies and wire transfers. They'd need Rita to hold up under cross-examination that would try to destroy her credibility by painting her as a scorned wife getting revenge. They'd need Derek to explain why his testimony should be trusted when he'd spent years lying for his mother. And they'd need Sarah, the widow, the woman who'd lost her husband and spent 3 years being dismissed as unstable. She'd have to sit in that witness box and tell her story while Patricia's lawyer tried to make her look crazy. Had to present Thomas's evidence while they suggested she'd fabricated it after his death. Had to convince 12 strangers that her murdered husband deserved justice. Marcus watched Sarah process all this and saw the moment she shifted from grieving widow to avenging warrior. Her spine straightened, her voice steadied. She looked Agent Warren in the eye and said the only thing that mattered. "Whatever you need from me, you'll have it." Thomas died for truth. I'm not letting his death be meaningless because I'm scared of what some lawyer might say about me. Agent Warren nodded with the kind of respect lawyers reserve for clients who understood what they were signing up for. Then we build the case properly. Document everything, prepare every witness, assume the defense will fight dirty, and make sure we fight cleaner but harder. She turned to Marcus. "Mr. Hayes, you started this by refusing to pay a fraudulent bill. Your bridge, your documentation, your technical expertise. We're going to need that precision throughout the trial. Can you handle coordinating the technical evidence with our forensic accountants?" Marcus had spent 30 years managing complex engineering projects where mistakes meant buildings fell down and people died. Trial preparation felt similar. High stakes, multiple moving parts. Success depended on every detail being exactly right. He could do this. "I'm in," he said, "whatever it takes." The preparation consumed the next 3 months. Marcus's cabin became secondary headquarters when Margaret's dining room overflowed with documents. His engineer's brain proved invaluable for organizing evidence into logical sequences that told stories through data. He created timelines cross-referencing HOA financial records with victim testimony, built spreadsheets tracking every fraudulent charge against the resident who'd been targeted, mapped the flow of money from HOA accounts through shell companies into Patricia and Gerald's personal use. The women's network that had started as informal mutual aid transformed into professional operation. Margaret coordinated witness preparation with the precision she'd used managing classrooms of 30 students for 4 decades. Janet used her paralegal training to help victims understand the legal process and what to expect when testifying. Grace worked with the state's forensic accountants to explain banking patterns and financial irregularities. Emma managed digital documentation and social media strategy, making sure the story stayed in public consciousness without compromising the prosecution. Rita Masterson filed for divorce and reclaimed her maiden name in the same week. Rita Shaw at 59, starting over in an apartment Margaret helped her find and furnish with donations from the community. She got hired back at the pharmacy she'd retired from, working part-time and rebuilding the professional identity she'd sacrificed for a marriage that turned out to be built on lies and gambling addiction, and crimes she'd been too trusting to see. But the hardest work Rita did was preparing to testify against the man she'd been married to for 35 years. Agent Warren had been blunt about what that would entail. Gerald's defense attorney would try to paint her as vindictive ex-wife lying to get revenge, would suggest she'd known about the fraud all along and participated in it, would imply she'd given Patricia the digoxin knowing what it would be used for. Rita would have to sit there and take it while they tried to destroy her credibility and make a jury doubt every word she said. The preparation sessions happened in Agent Warren's office with Catherine Reeves, the assistant district attorney who'd be prosecuting the case. Reeves was 42, had tried over 100 felony cases, and had a conviction rate that made defense attorneys dread seeing her name on filings. She was also relentless in preparing witnesses, pushing them harder in practice than any defense attorney could in trial, so they'd be ready for anything. She put Rita through mock cross-examinations that left her in tears, asked questions designed to humiliate and confuse, attacked her from angles Rita hadn't considered, made her defend decisions she'd made in good faith when she still believed her husband was the man he'd pretended to be. It was brutal. It was necessary. And Rita came back every time, stronger each session, learning to stay calm under attack and stick to simple truths that couldn't be twisted. Sarah went through the same preparation, worse in some ways because she was the primary victim, the widow whose husband had been murdered. Reeves played Patricia's defense attorney and went after Sarah with everything. Suggested she'd killed Thomas herself. Implied she'd fabricated his investigation. Questioned why she'd waited 3 years to demand exhumation if she really believed he was murdered. Each attack felt like reliving Thomas's death and the grief that followed. But Sarah learned to absorb the blows and respond with facts instead of emotion. Marcus watched one of these sessions and had to leave halfway through. Watching someone systematically try to destroy Sarah's credibility while she sat there taking it felt like torture. He found Agent Warren in the hallway afterward. "How can you do that to her? She's the victim here." Warren's expression was sympathetic but unyielding. "I'm not doing it to her. I'm doing it for her. Patricia's lawyer will be 10 times worse, and he'll do it in front of a jury ready to judge her. If she can't handle my version, she'll fall apart on the stand and Patricia walks free. Is that what you want?" Marcus had no answer for that. He understood the logic. Stress-tested structures before they faced real-world loads. Sarah was being stress-tested so she wouldn't fail when it mattered most. Understanding didn't make it easier to watch. But Sarah never complained, never asked them to ease up. She took everything they threw at her and came back asking what else she needed to prepare for. The woman who'd spent 3 years setting out coffee mugs and talking to photos had transformed into someone Marcus barely recognized. Stronger, harder, focused on a goal with the kind of intensity he associated with people who'd found purpose worth suffering for. Derek Thornhill's preparation was different. He wasn't a victim. He was a cooperating co-conspirator who'd helped commit the crimes he was now testifying about. That made him vulnerable to attacks on credibility that went beyond anything Sarah or Rita would face. Why should a jury believe a man who'd spent years lying for his mother? What made his testimony trustworthy when he'd falsified government records and enabled fraud, and only came forward when he got caught? Reeves worked with Derek on something she called the redemption narrative. Not spinning the facts, but presenting them in a way that showed genuine remorse and transformation. Derek had to own what he'd done completely. No excuses, no blaming his mother or his grief over his father, or the financial pressure his family faced. He'd made choices, bad choices, illegal choices, choices that hurt people he'd grown up with. But he'd also made the choice to stop, to come forward, to provide evidence, even though it meant testifying against his own mother. That choice cost him everything: his family, his reputation, his career. He'd done it anyway because it was right. The jury needed to see that transformation, needed to believe he was a man who'd made terrible mistakes but was trying to atone for them. Marcus sat in on one of Derek's sessions and found himself unexpectedly moved by the kid's genuine anguish. Derek was 28 but looked older, aged by guilt in ways that showed in every line of his face. When Reeves pushed him on why he'd helped his mother for so long, Derek's answer came out raw and unpolished. Because she was all I had left. Dad died and she was drowning and I thought I was saving her. Thought if I could just help her get through this rough patch, she'd go back to being the mom I remembered. The one who made cookies and coached my soccer team and believed in doing right. But that woman was gone. Maybe she never existed. Maybe the stress just revealed who she always was underneath. I don't know anymore. All I know is I helped a criminal hurt innocent people, and I have to live with that forever. The honesty was devastating. Marcus saw Reeves make a note. That's good. That's what you tell the jury. Exactly like that. The grand jury proceedings happened in late October, 3 months after the arrests. The courthouse sat in the center of town, a building that had witnessed 100 years of justice and injustice in equal measure. Built in 1920 with granite quarried from local mountains, it carried the weight of permanence that government buildings were supposed to project. Inside, the grand jury room was smaller than Marcus expected. Not the dramatic courtroom of television trials, but a conference room with 23 citizens sitting in judgment. Grand juries were different from trial juries in ways most people didn't understand. Lower burden of proof, probable cause instead of beyond reasonable doubt. No defense attorneys present to cross-examine or object, just prosecutors presenting evidence and witnesses testifying to convince grand jurors that enough evidence existed to indict. But Catherine Reeves treated it like trial preparation, using the opportunity to test her case and see how witnesses held up under questioning from jurors who could ask whatever they wanted. Sarah testified first, taking her seat in the witness chair with hands folded in lap to keep them from shaking. She'd been through this in practice sessions with Reeves dozens of times, but practice and reality carried different weights. These were real people judging whether her murdered husband's case deserved to go forward. Real citizens who would decide if Patricia Thornhill faced trial for taking Thomas's life. Reeves walked her through Thomas's investigation methodically, each question designed to establish timeline and motive and opportunity. Sarah presented his files one by one, explaining each document and what it proved: the fraudulent invoices to companies that didn't exist, the Shell Corporation registrations tracing back to Gerald Masterson's family members, the pattern of targeting vulnerable residents with fake charges they'd be too scared or too broke to challenge. She explained how Thomas had grown increasingly concerned in his final months as treasurer, how he'd asked Patricia for detailed accounting and been stonewalled, how he'd started secretly copying records and documenting everything because he knew confronting them openly would get him removed from the board, how he'd been proven right when they voted him out after he demanded transparency. But the moment that changed the room's energy came when Sarah described finding the letter Thomas had left for her, the envelope marked with her name and 4 words that had haunted her for 3 years. If something happens. Her voice broke on those words despite all her preparation. The grand jurors leaned forward as one, caught in the reality of a man who'd known he was in danger and documented everything anyway, because truth mattered more than safety. Thomas knew, Sarah said, composing herself with visible effort. He knew they might kill him for exposing their crimes. He left me instructions on what to do if he died suddenly, how to find his evidence, who to contact. He did everything he could to make sure his death wouldn't stop the investigation. And I failed him for 3 years by being too broken to follow through. One of the grand jurors, an older woman who reminded Marcus of Margaret, spoke up. Ma'am, you didn't fail anyone. You survived grief and loss and eventually found the courage to seek truth. That's not failure. That's heroism. Sarah wiped her eyes and continued. Presented the flash drive with all Thomas's documentation. Explained how the evidence proved systematic fraud spanning years. How Patricia and Gerald had stolen over $500,000 from neighbors who trusted them to manage community finances. How Thomas's threat to expose them had signed his death warrant. When Reeves finished with questions, the grand jury foreman asked if they could examine Thomas's actual files. Sarah had brought copies, organized exactly the way Thomas had left them, because she couldn't bear to change his system. The jurors passed them around, reading invoices for landscaping companies that never landscaped, infrastructure consulting from consultants who didn't exist, maintenance charges for work never performed. The documents told their story more powerfully than any testimony could. These weren't abstract numbers. They were theft from neighbors, from elderly residents on fixed incomes, from young families struggling with mortgages, from every vulnerable person Patricia and Gerald could exploit. Rita testified next, walking into that same room with the posture of someone going to execution. She'd divorced Gerald 2 months ago, but the wounds were still raw. 35 years of marriage ending in courtroom testimony against the man she'd promised to love in sickness and health. But promises were void when they were built on lies, and Gerald had been lying for years about everything that mattered. She explained her background as pharmacist, how she'd kept medication samples after retirement, a habit from decades of practice, how those samples included digoxin, carefully controlled substance used to treat heart conditions, but deadly in excessive doses, how Patricia had visited her home the week before Thomas died, been alone in Rita's office for 20 minutes while Rita made tea in the kitchen. Why didn't you lock the medication cabinet? Reeves asked. Rita's voice came out small. Because Patricia was my friend. I'd known her for 20 years. Never imagined I needed to lock anything when she was there. Never thought someone I trusted would steal medication to murder someone. When did you realize what had happened? Rita took a breath. When the exhumation results came back. When Dr. Patel said Thomas died from digoxin poisoning, I went home and checked my medication inventory. The digoxin samples were gone. I'd had 6 vials, all missing. I knew then what she'd done, what I'd inadvertently enabled by trusting her. The grand jurors asked pointed questions. How could Rita be sure Patricia took them? Could Gerald have taken them instead? Could someone else have had access? Rita answered each one with the kind of detail that came from months of preparation, and the certainty of someone who'd replayed those days thousands of times looking for what she'd missed. Then Reeves introduced the evidence that made Gerald's involvement undeniable, the text messages between him and Patricia, recovered from both their phones through search warrants executed during the arrests. Messages that showed Gerald knew Thomas was investigating them, knew Patricia planned to handle it, knew what she meant by handle, and did nothing to stop her. Rita read them aloud to the grand jury, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Her husband's words, his knowledge of planned murder, his weak protest that they'd gone too far, followed by his silence when Patricia told him to stay quiet or they'd both go down. I married a monster, Rita said when she finished reading. Or maybe I married a man who became a monster when gambling addiction and financial desperation destroyed whatever conscience he once had. Either way, the man in those text messages isn't someone I recognize, isn't someone I can protect, isn't someone who deserves protection. The forensic evidence came through Dr. Patel, who explained the science of digoxin poisoning with the kind of precision that made complex medicine understandable to laypeople. He brought photographs from the exhumation, tissue samples showing digoxin concentrations, charts comparing therapeutic levels to what was found in Thomas's system. The levels weren't just elevated, he explained. They were 4 times what would be prescribed for heart conditions. And Thomas had no heart condition, no prescription, no reason to have any digoxin in his system. The only way it got there was through deliberate administration by someone who knew exactly what dose would cause cardiac arrest. He walked them through the timeline. Digoxin takes 12 to 24 hours to reach peak effect. Based on concentration levels in different tissues, he could pinpoint when it was administered. The evening before Thomas died, the same evening he'd attended a community meeting where he'd confronted Patricia about financial irregularities. The same evening he'd come home and told Sarah he was going to the county prosecutor the next day with everything he'd documented. He never made it to that appointment. By morning he was dead. Could this have been accidental? One juror asked. Could he have been exposed somehow without knowing? Dr. Patel shook his head. Not at these levels. Not pharmaceutical-grade digoxin. This was deliberate poisoning by someone with access to medication and knowledge of how to use it lethally. Derek testified last, the weight of betraying his mother visible in every line of his face. He'd lost 30 pounds since the arrests, looked 10 years older than 28, carried himself like someone who'd stopped sleeping properly months ago, and didn't expect to ever sleep well again. His hands shook when he was sworn in. His voice cracked on the oath to tell the truth. The whole truth, nothing but the truth. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. A man who'd spent years lying now swearing to truth. He walked the grand jury through his role methodically. Each admission like pulling teeth, but necessary for any hope of redemption. The falsification of county records Patricia had asked him to perform. The removal of Frank Morrison's infrastructure report from county archives, a report that would have exposed years of HOA neglect and mismanagement. The creation of false easement documents, making it appear the county had approved an emergency access corridor that never existed. The midnight installation of signs on Marcus Hayes' property to manufacture evidence of HOA authority that was entirely fabricated. Each admission came with context. Not excuses, but explanations of how a decent person made indecent choices, one small compromise at a time. His father had died 5 years ago from cancer. The medical bills had been catastrophic despite insurance. His mother had been drowning in debt, terrified of losing the house, desperate for any income she could find. The HOA president position paid $18,000 a year. Not much, but something. A lifeline for a widow trying to stay afloat. Then she'd found other ways to make money. Ways that required Derek's help accessing county records and creating documentation that looked official. She'd told him it was temporary, told him she'd pay back everything she borrowed, told him the residents they were charging were wealthy enough that the fees didn't really hurt them, told him that family came first and he was all she had left after his father died. Derek had believed her because he wanted to believe her, because she was his mother, and he loved her. And the alternative was accepting that she'd become a criminal. So he'd helped, altered records, created false documents, enabled fraud that went on for years and hurt dozens of people. But he drew a line at murder. When the exhumation results came back showing Thomas Chen had been poisoned, Derek had gone through his mother's correspondence looking for anything that might prove she wasn't involved. Instead, he'd found evidence proving she was. The text messages with Gerald Masterson discussing Thomas as a problem. Patricia's ominous statement that she'd handle it. Gerald's 3 a.m. text saying they'd gone too far. Patricia's response telling him to stay quiet or they'd both go down. Derek showed those messages to the grand jury now, displayed on screen so everyone could read them. His voice shook reading his mother's words. Her casual dismissal of Gerald's conscience. Her threat to take them both down if he didn't stay silent about what she'd done. The messages painted picture of woman who'd planned murder and executed it and felt no remorse beyond worry about getting caught. A grand juror asked the question everyone was thinking. Why come forward now? Why betray your mother after helping her for years? Derek's answer came out raw and honest, in a way no amount of coaching could have produced. Because I couldn't live with knowing she killed someone and doing nothing about it. Fraud is terrible. What we did to our neighbors, stealing from them, threatening them, that's unforgivable. But murder? That's different. That's a line I couldn't ignore. I kept thinking about Thomas Chen, about how he'd coached Little League when I was a kid, how he'd believed in community service and doing right, how he died because he tried to stop what we were doing. And I realized my father would be ashamed of who I'd become, would be disgusted that I'd helped hurt people he'd known and cared about. So I made a choice, late, too late to undo the damage, but the only choice I could make that would let me eventually look at myself in the mirror again. I came forward, gave investigators everything, agreed to testify even though it means my mother will never forgive me, and I'll live with that for the rest of my life. He paused, collecting himself. But at least I'll be living as someone who finally did the right thing, even if it cost me everything, even if it came too late to save Mr. Chen. At least I stopped enabling more harm. The room stayed silent for a long moment after he finished. Derek's testimony wasn't polished or perfect. It was messy and painful and completely genuine, the kind of thing that couldn't be faked or coached. The jurors saw a young man who'd made terrible choices and was trying to atone for them. Whether that absolved him was for courts to decide later. But his testimony about his mother's guilt was credible in a way that transcended any motivation to lie. Catherine Reeves concluded the presentation by summarizing the evidence. Motive established through the fraud Thomas had discovered. Means established through Rita's testimony about the stolen digoxin. Opportunity established through timeline showing Patricia alone with Thomas's food the night before he died. Intent proven through text messages discussing him as a problem to be handled. And the medical evidence showing definitively that he'd been murdered. The case was overwhelming, multiple witnesses corroborating each element, physical evidence, documentary evidence, scientific evidence, a pattern of criminal behavior spanning years, and a murder committed to cover up that pattern when someone threatened to expose it. The grand jury deliberated for 3 hours, shorter than expected, according to Agent Warren. They returned indictments on every charge. Patricia Thornhill for murder in the first degree, fraud, embezzlement, witness tampering, conspiracy, and 6 other felonies. Gerald Masterson for accessory to murder, fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. Derek Thornhill for falsification of government records, with prosecution recommending suspended sentence due to cooperation. The trial was scheduled for January, 3 months away. That gave both sides time to prepare. For Patricia to hire the best defense team money could buy. For the prosecution to refine their case and prepare witnesses for the ordeal ahead. For the community to brace itself for the media attention and public scrutiny that would come when the trial started. Marcus used the time to work on something he'd been thinking about since the arrests. The bridge that started everything needed to become more than personal memorial. It needed to honor everyone who'd fought this battle and everyone who'd been hurt by Patricia's crimes. He spent weekends adding elements to the structure. A memorial plaque listing Thomas Chen's name and the words he died pursuing truth. A dedication to every resident who'd been victimized by fraudulent HOA charges. A commitment that the bridge would always remain private property, never subject to claims of eminent domain or community control. A permanent monument to the principle that what you build with your own hands belongs to you. Linda would have approved. She'd believed in making meaning from pain, turning suffering into something that helped others. The bridge had been Marcus's attempt to honor her memory through engineering. Now it was becoming a community symbol of resistance to corruption, of ordinary people refusing to be silenced, of bridges connecting more than land. Sarah spent the time working with Amanda, who'd stayed in North Carolina instead of returning to California. Mother and daughter had spent 3 years mostly estranged, connected by duty more than genuine relationship. Amanda's career had consumed her. Sarah's grief had isolated her. They'd spoken on holidays and birthdays with the kind of shallow conversation that avoided anything real. But preparing for trial forced them into proximity and genuine communication. Amanda helped her mother organize testimony and practice responses to hostile questions. Sarah helped Amanda process the reality that her father had been murdered, and they'd both spent 3 years not knowing. They cried together, got angry together, found their way back to the relationship that grief and distance had fractured. One evening, they sat in the kitchen where Thomas had died, drinking tea and talking about him in ways they hadn't been able to when the wound was fresh. Amanda shared memories Sarah had forgotten. Sarah told stories Amanda had never heard. They built a fuller picture of the man they'd both loved, honoring him by remembering him completely instead of just grieving the loss. "Your father would be proud of you," Sarah said. Not just for coming home, but for staying, for helping me through this. Amanda shook her head. I should have been here 3 years ago. Should have believed you when you said something was wrong. You couldn't have known. I didn't even trust my own instincts. How could I expect you to? Still, I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me. Sarah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. You're here now. That's what matters. The Women's Network continued meeting weekly, but the purpose had shifted from investigation to preparation. Margaret coordinated schedules to make sure witnesses got to their sessions with the prosecution. Janet helped people understand what to expect in court. Grace worked with victims to calculate damages for the civil suits that would follow the criminal trial. Emma organized childcare and meal trains so parents could attend preparation sessions without worrying about their kids. Rita had become central figure in the group despite being newcomer, or maybe because of it. She represented the possibility of transformation at any age, of finding courage to leave a marriage that had become a cage, of choosing truth over comfort, of starting over when most people would have given up. The younger women looked to her as proof that it was never too late to change your life. The older women saw her as peer who'd survived what many of them feared most. One night after a particularly difficult preparation session, Rita stayed late at Margaret's house. Just the core group: Sarah, Margaret, Janet, Grace, Emma, and Rita. Marcus had been there earlier, but left to give them space for conversation that felt private, even though he was part of the team. Rita spoke into the quiet. I've been thinking about Patricia, about how she became what she is. We were friends once, 20 years ago when we both moved here. Both new wives in a small town, both trying to fit in. We had coffee together, talked about our kids. She seemed normal, nice even. What changed? Emma asked. Life, Margaret said. Her husband got sick. Medical bills destroyed them financially. She was widowed young with a son to raise alone. This community should have supported her. We didn't. Everyone was too busy. She was too proud to ask for help. That doesn't excuse what she did, Janet pointed out. No, Sarah agreed, but it explains how someone goes from normal person to murderer. Isolation, desperation, the belief that no one else will help, so you have to take care of yourself by any means necessary. She chose control instead of community, power instead of connection. She saw other women as competition, Grace added, as threats instead of allies. That's the tragedy. She could have had what we have: support, friendship, people who'd help her through hard times. Instead, she built walls and attacked anyone who got close. Emma looked around the circle of women who'd saved her from similar isolation. I could have become her, if you all hadn't reached out when I was drowning in postpartum depression and fear. If Margaret hadn't insisted I come to that first meeting. I was so close to just paying that bill and staying silent. Too scared to fight, too exhausted to care. But you didn't, Rita said. You found courage. We all did. That's the difference between us and Patricia. She chose fear. We chose each other. The conversation drifted to the trial, to strategy and preparation, and the uncertainty ahead. But underneath the practical discussion ran current of something deeper: gratitude for the community they'd built from crisis, recognition that fighting corruption together had given them all something they'd been missing: purpose, connection, proof that they mattered. Marcus drove Sarah home that night, both of them quiet and comfortable way that came from months of working together. They'd become odd kind of team, the grief-broken engineer and the widow seeking justice for her murdered husband. Their losses were different, but the shape of grief was similar: the hole left behind, the struggle to find reason to keep going, the discovery that purpose could fill some of that emptiness, even if it never fully healed. You ready for this? Marcus asked as they pulled up to Sarah's house. For trial? No, but I'm doing it anyway. That's pretty much the definition of courage. Sarah smiled. Thomas used to say courage is just fear with a plan. We've got the plan. Catherine Reeves made sure of that. Now we execute and hope the jury sees the truth. They will, Marcus said with more confidence than he felt. The evidence is overwhelming. Evidence doesn't always matter. Reasonable doubt, jury nullification, sympathy for a widow who lost her husband and made bad choices. Patricia's lawyers will try everything. Then we make sure our truth is louder than their lies. Sarah gathered her things and paused before getting out of the truck. Marcus, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you think Linda would have liked me? Would have approved of this? Marcus considered the question seriously. Linda believed in standing up for what's right even when it costs you. Believed in community and connection and refusing to let fear win. She would have loved you. Probably would have been running this whole operation if she were here. I wish I could have known her. She would have said the same about Thomas. They would have ganged up on us, made us go to dinner parties and neighborhood events and all the social things we both try to avoid. Sarah laughed. Sounds terrible. Would have been wonderful, Marcus admitted, having them here, even dealing with dinner parties. They sat with that for a moment. The weight of absence. The ache of missing people who shaped you and then left you to figure out how to keep going without them. But we're doing okay, Sarah said finally, making them proud, I think. Finishing what Thomas started. Building what Linda believed in. Yeah, Marcus agreed. We're doing okay. Sarah went inside to a house that no longer felt like tomb. Amanda was waiting up, tea already made, ready to talk through the day or just sit in companionable silence. Mother and daughter finding their way back to each other through shared mission. Marcus drove home to his cabin and his bridge, and the life he'd built from grief. The cameras he'd installed to catch trespassers now just recorded deer and raccoons, and the occasional hiker admiring the craftsmanship. The sign Derek had installed in the middle of the night had been removed as evidence, leaving the bridge unmarked except for the memorial plaque Marcus had added. He stood on the deck looking at stars reflected in the creek below. Tomorrow would bring more preparation, more evidence review, more coordination with prosecutors and witnesses, and the complex machinery of justice grinding toward its conclusion. But tonight, he could stand here and remember why he'd built this bridge in the first place. For Linda. For the dream she never got to live. For the belief that some things were worth building even when you didn't know who would use them or how they'd matter. The bridge had brought him Sarah and the Women's Network and a community fighting together for something that mattered, had given him purpose beyond his grief, had proved that sometimes you build bridges not knowing they'll save lives until the flood comes and everyone needs a way across. He pulled out his phone and opened the photo Linda had taken of herself the day she'd written that bucket list. Retirement cabin where we can hear the water. She'd gotten part of her wish. He heard the water every day. And he'd learned what she already knew, that the sound of water was soothing, but the sound of community was what really healed. 3 months until trial. 3 months to make sure every detail was perfect, every witness prepared, every piece of evidence documented and organized and ready to present. Marcus was good at preparation, had spent his career planning for contingencies and stress testing designs, and making sure nothing was left to chance. This was just another project, higher stakes than any building he'd ever designed. But the principle was the same: do the work, check the calculations, trust the math and the evidence, and the people willing to stand up and tell the truth. Patricia Thornhill had thought she could steal and cheat and murder without consequences, had counted on people being too scared or too isolated or too tired to fight back. She'd been wrong, and in 3 months, a jury would prove exactly how wrong. Marcus went inside and got to work on the next day's preparation. There was always more to do, more evidence to organize, more timelines to verify, more witnesses to coordinate. The work never stopped. But that was okay. He'd learned something important in the months since he'd knocked on Sarah's door and changed both their lives. Some work was worth doing no matter how much it cost. Some bridges were worth building even if you had to fight every step of the way. And some battles mattered enough that you showed up every day and did what needed doing, even when you were tired and scared and not sure how it would end. Linda had known that. Thomas had proved it. Sarah was living it, and Marcus was finally learning what they'd understood all along. You didn't have to stop being broken to do something that mattered. You just had to care enough to try anyway. The trial began on a Monday in January, when winter had settled into the mountains. The courthouse filled before dawn with people who'd waited 3 years to see justice. Sarah arrived with Amanda and Margaret. Rita came alone. Marcus sat with Frank Morrison and other residents who'd formed the investigation's core. Jury selection took 3 days. 12 citizens and 4 alternates chosen from 80 potential jurors. Patricia's defense attorney, Randall Vickers, struck anyone with HOA problems. Catherine Reeves struck anyone with financial ties to Patricia's circle. What remained after 3 days of questioning was 12 people who claimed they could be impartial. 6 men, 6 women, ages ranging from 32 to 71. blue collar and white collar, and retired. The kind of cross-section that was supposed to represent the community's conscience. Judge Denise Huang presided with the efficiency of someone who'd tried hundreds of cases and had no patience for theatrics. She was 56, had been on the bench for 12 years, and ran her courtroom with rules that were clear and consequences that were immediate. No speaking out of turn, no emotional outbursts, no playing to the gallery. The law would be followed precisely, or she'd hold people in contempt without hesitation. Opening statements started on Thursday morning. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles until the bailiff made them move to comply with fire codes. Every local news station had cameras outside. National media had picked up the story because it had all the elements that sold papers and drove clicks. HOA corruption, elderly victims, murder disguised as natural causes, a community rising up to fight back. Catherine Reeves stood to present the prosecution's case wearing the same understated gray suit she'd worn to every pretrial hearing. Her strategy was to avoid flash and focus on facts. Let the evidence speak. Build the case brick by methodical brick until the wall of proof was too high for any defense to scale. This is a case about trust and betrayal, she began, about two people elected to serve their community who chose instead to steal from it, about a good man who discovered their crimes and paid with his life, about a widow who spent 3 years knowing in her heart that her husband was murdered but lacking proof until science and investigation finally confirmed what she'd always suspected. She laid out the timeline. Patricia Thornhill elected HOA president 7 years ago. Gerald Masterson vice president for 6. Thomas Chen serving as treasurer for 3 years before they removed him for asking too many questions about where money was going. His sudden death 2 weeks later from what doctors called natural causes, but what was actually carefully planned murder by digoxin poisoning. The evidence would show systematic fraud. Over $500,000 stolen through fake invoices to shell companies. Vulnerable residents targeted with fraudulent charges they were too scared or too broke to challenge, a pattern of predation spanning years. And when Thomas Chen threatened to expose it all, Patricia Thornhill poisoned him and made it look like a heart attack. You'll hear from Sarah Chen, Thomas's widow, from Rita Shaw, who was married to Gerald Masterson and unwittingly provided the weapon used to kill Thomas, from Derek Thornhill, Patricia's own son, who helped enable the fraud and came forward when he realized his mother had committed murder. From doctors and accountants and investigators who'll explain exactly how this crime was planned and executed. By the time we're done, you'll have no doubt. Patricia Thornhill and Gerald Masterson are guilty of every charge, and justice demands you hold them accountable. She sat down without drama or flourish, just a lawyer who'd presented facts and trusted them to be enough. Randall Vickers stood for the defense and immediately tried to shift the narrative. His opening was all sympathy and reasonable doubt. Patricia Thornhill was a widow who'd lost her husband to cancer, a single mother who'd raised a son alone, a community volunteer who'd given thousands of hours to serving her neighbors. Yes, there were accounting irregularities. Yes, mistakes were made. But fraud, murder. The prosecution wanted the jury to believe this grandmother was a criminal mastermind who killed someone in cold blood. The truth was simpler and sadder. Thomas Chen died of natural causes, just like the original autopsy concluded. His widow, devastated by grief, had invented a conspiracy because she couldn't accept that sometimes good people just die. The exhumation results showing digoxin could be explained by environmental exposure or post-mortem contamination. The text messages between Patricia and Gerald were being misinterpreted. The financial records showed confusion and poor bookkeeping, not intentional theft. Patricia Thornhill made mistakes. She'd be the first to admit that. But she's not a murderer. And when you've heard all the evidence, when you've seen how the prosecution's case rests on speculation and grief-driven conspiracy theories, you'll find her not guilty. Marcus watched the jury during both openings, tried to read their faces the way he read structural stress in beams, looking for micro-expressions that suggested belief or skepticism. Most stayed carefully neutral. A few glanced at Sarah when Reeves mentioned her. One older man nodded slightly when Vickers talked about grief inventing conspiracies. Not enough to draw conclusions from, but enough to worry Marcus that reasonable doubt might find purchase where it shouldn't. The prosecution's case began that afternoon with the foundation, establishing the HOA structure and Patricia's role and authority. County officials testified about incorporation documents and bylaws. Former board members described how Patricia ran meetings and controlled access to financial records, building the framework before introducing evidence of crimes committed within it. The real case started the following Monday with the financial evidence. Chen, the accountant who'd worked with their investigation group, testified for 6 hours across 2 days. She walked the jury through forensic accounting analysis with charts and graphs, and a gift for making complex financial crimes understandable to regular people. She showed how money flowed from HOA accounts to shell companies that existed only on paper, how those companies were registered to Gerald Masterson's relatives and associates, how wire transfers went out for services never rendered by vendors who never existed, how the money ended up in Patricia and Gerald's personal accounts within days of leaving the HOA. The pattern was unmistakable once laid out visually. Fake invoice submitted. Patricia approves payment. Money transferred to shell company. Shell company transfers to personal account. Money used for personal expenses that had nothing to do with HOA business. Over and over for years. $547,000 stolen from neighbors who trusted their elected officials to manage community funds honestly. Vickers cross-examined hard, trying to suggest the accounting was flawed or the interpretations were biased. Carol held firm. She'd been doing forensic accounting for 23 years, had testified in over 100 fraud cases. The evidence here was as clear as any she'd ever seen. The defense could question her conclusions all they wanted. The numbers didn't lie. Individual victims testified next. Emma Rodriguez crying as she described paying $5,000 for playground restoration while dealing with postpartum depression and a newborn. The playground Patricia claimed to restore had been torn down years before Emma moved to Riverbend. Ed Wilson explained being charged $6,200 for well modernization, despite having no well. How he'd stopped buying medications to save for legal fees, causing dangerous health problems. Janet Kowalski testified about fake violations and systematic intimidation. Each victim added weight. Each story showed pattern. Each testimony made it harder to believe this was innocent confusion. Then came the evidence about Thomas Chen's murder. Sarah testified for 2 full days. First about Thomas's investigation and the evidence he'd compiled. Then about his final weeks and the growing fear she'd seen in him. The threats he'd received. The tampering with his car's brake lines that a mechanic had confirmed. His decision to document everything and leave instructions in case something happened to him. Vickers attacked her credibility hard during cross-examination. Suggested she was mentally unstable. Questioned why she'd waited 3 years to demand exhumation if she really believed Thomas was murdered. Implied she'd fabricated the letter Thomas left because she needed someone to blame for death that was actually natural. Sarah held firm. She had prepared for this, knew every attack was coming, responded with quiet dignity that was harder to shake than angry defensiveness would have been. I waited 3 years because I was broken by grief, she said. Because everyone told me I was imagining things, and I started to believe them. Because being a paranoid widow seemed worse than being a widow who'd accepted natural death. But I knew. Somewhere deep, I always knew. And when the evidence finally proved it, I stopped doubting myself. Rita Shaw testified next, explaining her background as pharmacist and how she'd kept medication samples including digoxin. How Patricia had visited the week before Thomas died and been alone in the office where Rita stored those samples. How all 6 vials of digoxin had gone missing. How she'd trusted Patricia enough not to lock the cabinet when a friend was visiting. Vickers tried to suggest Rita was lying to get revenge on Gerald for gambling away their retirement. Tried to imply she'd given Patricia the digoxin knowing what it would be used for and was now trying to shift blame. Rita's answer was simple and devastating. I loved my husband for 35 years. Despite everything he did, part of me still loves the man I thought he was. You think I'd be here destroying him if I had any choice? I'm here because Thomas Chen deserves justice. Because my silence enabled his murder. Because I can't live with myself if I protect the people who killed him. The medical evidence came through Dr. Patel with the kind of scientific precision that left no room for interpretation. digoxin levels 4 times therapeutic dose, timeline showing administration the night before death, impossibility of accidental exposure at those concentrations. The original autopsy's failure to test for it because sudden cardiac death in an elderly man didn't raise suspicion. The new analysis proving conclusively that Thomas Chen had been poisoned. Vickers brought his own medical expert, who suggested the digoxin could have come from environmental sources, that foxglove plants contained similar compounds, that post-mortem contamination was possible. Dr. Patel's rebuttal destroyed these theories methodically. Different chemical markers, different concentration patterns, different tissue distribution. This was pharmaceutical-grade digoxin administered deliberately, not environmental exposure or contamination. The prosecution rested their case on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks into trial. They'd presented overwhelming evidence of fraud and compelling evidence of murder. Built their case the way Marcus built structures, layer upon layer of proof, each element supporting the others, redundancy built in, so that even if one piece failed, the whole remained standing. The defense case started the next morning with character witnesses for Patricia. Neighbors who said she'd organized community events, former board members who praised her dedication, people who'd known her for years and couldn't believe she was capable of murder. Each testimony was meant to humanize her, show she was more than the monster prosecution painted. But cross-examination revealed that most hadn't had real friendships with Patricia, hadn't known about her financial situation, hadn't seen behind the facade she maintained. They testified to the person they thought they knew, not to who she actually was. Patricia herself took the stand against Vickers's advice. She insisted, believed she could convince the jury she was innocent through force of personality and selective truth. Marcus had seen this before. People who'd spent years lying to themselves, convinced they could lie convincingly to others. She testified to being overwhelmed by HOA finances she didn't fully understand, admitted there were irregularities, but claimed ignorance of their scope, denied any knowledge of Thomas's murder, painted herself as dedicated volunteer who'd made mistakes but had good intentions. Then Catherine Reeves began cross-examination and systematically destroyed every claim Patricia made. "You testified you didn't fully understand the finances," Reeves said, "but these emails show you personally approving wire transfers to specific accounts. You knew exactly where the money was going." Patricia fumbled for explanation. "I signed what Gerald told me to sign, trusted his judgment on financial matters." Reeves pulled up more emails. "Here you're instructing Gerald which shell company to use for a particular invoice. Here you're calculating how much can be billed without raising suspicion. Here you're directing him to target elderly residents because they're less likely to fight back. Does that sound like someone who didn't understand what was happening?" Patricia's composure began cracking. She'd underestimated Reeves, thought she could charm or confuse or deflect, but Reeves had every email, every document, every piece of evidence organized and ready. She'd spent months preparing for this cross-examination, and it showed. The questioning about Thomas's murder was devastating. Reeves established that Patricia was at the community meeting the night before he died. Established she knew Thomas was going to the prosecutor the next day. Established she'd visited Rita's house and been alone in the office where the digoxin was stored. "You sent this text to Gerald," Reeves said, displaying it on screen. "Thomas is going to the prosecutor tomorrow. I'll handle it." "What did you mean by handle? What did Patricia's answer came out weak. "Just that I'd talk to him, try to resolve things without involving authorities. And this message from Gerald the day after Thomas died. This is wrong. We went too far." What was he referring to? "I don't know, he was upset, stressed about the investigation." "Stressed because you'd murdered someone to stop that investigation." "Objection," Vickers called, leading and argumentative. "Sustained," Judge Huang said. "Rephrase, Ms. Reeves." But the damage was done. The jury had seen Patricia squirm, heard her non-answers to direct questions, watched her facade crack under pressure. Even without the answer, they'd drawn their own conclusions. Derek testified for the prosecution's rebuttal. His testimony was the redemption moment Marcus had watched him work toward for months. Derek owned everything he'd done, explained how he'd helped his mother commit fraud, how he'd falsified county records, how he'd installed that sign on Marcus's bridge hoping to manufacture evidence of HOA authority. Then he showed the text messages between his mother and Gerald, read them aloud to the jury, explained what he believed they meant, why he'd come forward despite knowing it meant betraying his mother, because some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences, because murder was that line. Vickers attacked him hard on cross, tried to paint him as ungrateful son turning on his mother to save himself. Derek's response was simple. I'm not saving myself. I'm facing 5 years for what I did. But that's nothing compared to what my mother deserves for killing someone. I'm here because it's the right thing to do, even though it's the hardest thing I've ever done. My father taught me integrity. My mother taught me what happens when you abandon it. I choose to honor my father's lessons. The trial broke for a long weekend while both sides prepared closing arguments. Marcus drove up to his bridge and sat there watching water flow underneath, thinking about the strange path that had led from building the structure to watching justice unfold in a courtroom. Sarah joined him after an hour. Neither had planned to meet there, but both needed the same thing: space away from the intensity of trial, air that wasn't thick with legal maneuvering and painful testimony, a moment to remember what they were fighting for beyond the courtroom drama. How are you holding up? Marcus asked. Tired, angry, hopeful, terrified the jury won't see what seems obvious to us. The evidence is overwhelming. Evidence doesn't always matter. Vickers is good at creating doubt, at making people question what they think they know. They sat in silence for a while. Then Sarah spoke again. Thank you for being there every day. I see you in the gallery and it helps, knowing I'm not alone in this. You were never alone. Even before I showed up at your door, Margaret and Janet and all the others were there. You just hadn't found them yet. But you were the catalyst, the bridge that connected us all. Marcus looked at the structure he'd built. Steel and wood, and the ghost of a dream Linda never got to see. I built this to escape grief, ended up creating something that brought people together instead. Linda would have loved the irony. Thomas too, Sarah said. He believed in community, died trying to protect it. This bridge became symbol of everything he fought for. They stayed until sunset, painted the sky colors that hurt to look at because they were too beautiful for a world that contained murder and betrayal. Then they drove back to their separate homes to prepare for the final arguments that would determine whether 3 years of investigation and months of trial had been worth it. Catherine Reeves delivered closing arguments on Tuesday morning. She walked the jury through the evidence systematically. Every fraudulent invoice, every victim's testimony, every piece of the financial paper trail. Then she shifted to the murder. Thomas Chen discovered their crimes, documented everything, was going to the prosecutor. Patricia Thornhill poisoned him with digoxin stolen from Rita Shaw's medication supplies. Made it look like natural causes. Thought she'd gotten away with it for 3 years until Sarah Chen refused to stop believing her husband was murdered. The evidence proves every element of every charge: means, motive, opportunity, pattern of behavior, intent to harm. You've heard from experts and victims and co-conspirators. You've seen documents and medical reports and text messages planning murder. The defense wants you to believe this is all coincidence or confusion or grief-driven conspiracy. But the simplest explanation is usually the right one. Patricia Thornhill committed fraud for years. When someone threatened to expose her, she killed him. She's guilty. The evidence proves it beyond any reasonable doubt. Vickers delivered defense closing with practiced polish. He admitted mistakes, acknowledged irregularities, but painted them as incompetence rather than malice, an overwhelmed widow managing complex finances. The murder? Speculation. No proof Patricia administered the digoxin. Circumstantial evidence and testimony from people with motives to lie. If you have doubt, you must acquit. There's reasonable doubt throughout this case. The jury got the case at noon on Wednesday. They deliberated for 9 hours before Judge Huang sent them home, returned Thursday morning, and deliberated 6 more hours. Word filtered out that they'd asked to review text messages and hear Dr. Patel's testimony again. Marcus waited with Sarah and the others in a conference room, hours crawling past, second-guessing, wondering, hoping they'd done enough. The call came at 3:30 Thursday afternoon. Verdict reached. Everyone back to the courtroom in 30 minutes. The walk down that hallway felt longer than any Marcus had taken in his life. Longer than the walk to Linda's hospital room when they'd called to say she had hours left. Longer than the walk to the cemetery to bury her. This walk carried different weight. Not personal loss, but collective justice. Not ending, but potential beginning. Sarah's hand trembled in Amanda's as they made their way back into the courtroom. Rita looked like she might be sick, her face pale and drawn. She'd testified against the man she'd loved for 35 years. If the jury didn't convict after what that cost her, Marcus wasn't sure she'd survive the guilt. Derek sat alone in the back row, ready to face whatever judgment came for his mother and for himself. The weight of betraying family pressed visible on his shoulders, hunching them forward like a man carrying stones. The gallery filled rapidly. Residents who'd fought this battle from the beginning, reporters who'd covered every day of trial, curious citizens who'd followed the story on news and felt invested in the outcome. The air was thick with tension and hope and fear in equal measure. Judge Huang entered, and the room stood as one. She surveyed the packed courtroom with expression that revealed nothing, took her seat, and instructed everyone else to do the same. Asked the bailiff to bring in the jury. They filed in looking exhausted. 15 hours of deliberation across 2 days showed in their faces, but they'd reached consensus. That much was clear from the way they avoided looking at Patricia. Marcus had read somewhere that juries who'd voted to convict wouldn't make eye contact with defendants. Something about guilt over the judgment they were about to render. Looking at Patricia now would make her too human. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Huang asked. The foreman stood. James Morrison, 58-year-old electrician who'd been chosen to speak for the other 11 because he was calm and articulate and took the responsibility seriously. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the verdict forms, handed them to Judge Huang. She reviewed them without expression, face carefully neutral. Then she handed them back to the clerk and instructed her to read the verdicts aloud. In the matter of the state versus Patricia Thornhill, on the charge of murder in the first degree, how does the jury find? The clerk's voice carried across the silent courtroom. "We find the defendant Patricia Thornhill guilty." Sarah made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Amanda held her while the validation washed over them. 3 years of being told she was paranoid, 3 years of doubting her own instincts, 3 years of grief compounded by uncertainty, all of it vindicated in that one word: guilty. The verdicts continued. On the charge of fraud in the first degree, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of witness tampering, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. 17 charges total. 17 times the clerk's voice pronounced guilt. 17 times the jury said they'd seen through the defense's attempts to create doubt. Marcus watched Patricia through each verdict. She sat motionless, face frozen in expression that might have been shock, or might have been complete detachment. Like she'd gone somewhere else inside herself, where none of this was happening. Where she was still the HOA president people feared and respected, rather than a convicted murderer facing life in prison. The verdicts for Gerald Masterson came next. Guilty of accessory to murder, guilty of fraud, guilty of embezzlement, guilty of conspiracy. Every charge the prosecution had brought, every crime they'd proven. The jury had believed Derek's testimony despite his obvious conflict, had seen through Patricia's performance on the stand, had looked at the mountain of evidence and reached the only conclusion it supported. Gerald broke when the murder verdict was read, collapsed forward with his head in his hands, sobbing loud enough that Judge Huang had to pause the proceedings. His attorney tried to comfort him, but there was no comfort available. He'd helped his wife kill someone to cover up fraud, and now he'd spend the rest of his life in prison for it. Derek sat motionless in the gallery, tears streaming silently down his face. Not tears of relief or vindication, just tears. For the mother he'd lost long before today. For the father who'd raised him better than this. For the life he'd destroyed by making bad choices, and the lives his mother had destroyed by making worse ones. His testimony had helped convict her. That was necessary. That was right. But it still meant he'd sent his own mother to die in prison. Judge Huang scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out. Thanked the jury for their service and the gravity they'd brought to their deliberations. Reminded everyone in the courtroom that emotional outbursts wouldn't be tolerated and that justice had been served through proper process. Then she dismissed them and released the courtroom to controlled chaos. Reporters rushed to file stories before competitors could beat them. Victims hugged each other, crying and laughing and processing emotions too complex for simple categorization. Margaret held Sarah while both women shook with relief. Rita sat alone, staring at her hands. maybe regretting everything, or maybe finally finding peace. Hard to tell which. Emma Rodriguez held her daughter Hope close, whispering things the baby couldn't understand but would hear about someday. How her mother had been part of something important, how ordinary people had stood up to corruption and won, how justice sometimes took time but could actually arrive if you refused to stop fighting for it. Marcus stood at the edge of it all, watching the culmination of 3 years of work that had started with a simple refusal to pay a fraudulent bill. His engineer's mind cataloged the elements that had made success possible. Evidence gathered methodically, witnesses prepared thoroughly, prosecution that understood both law and human nature, jury willing to see truth even when defense tried to obscure it. All the pieces fitting together the way a well-designed structure fit together, each element supporting the others, whole stronger than sum of parts. Outside the courthouse, January wind cut through coats that weren't quite warm enough. Sarah spoke to assembled media with Amanda beside her and the women's network surrounding her in protective circle. Cameras focused on her face. Microphones captured every word. She'd become public figure through this process, face of victims who refused to stay silent. She thanked the prosecution team, thanked investigators who'd taken their evidence seriously, thanked the community members who'd come forward despite fear of retaliation. And she honored Thomas in words that came from 3 years of grief, transformed into purpose. My husband died 3 years ago pursuing truth. He documented fraud because he believed community members deserved honest leadership. He left evidence behind because he knew exposing corruption might cost him his life. Today, that truth was finally acknowledged. Today, the people who killed him were held accountable. Justice took 3 years, but it came. For Thomas. For every victim of this fraud. For everyone who believed that standing up to corruption mattered, even when the cost was everything. Thank you for believing us. Thank you for seeing what we saw. Thank you for justice that seemed impossible, but turned out to be achievable when enough people refused to give up. Questions came rapid fire from reporters. How did she feel? What would she do now? What did she want people to learn from this case? Sarah answered each one thoughtfully. No sound bites or rehearsed responses. Just honest reflection from someone who'd survived something terrible and found meaning in it. Marcus watched from the edge of the crowd, not part of the media circus, but present for Sarah because she'd asked him to be there. Rita stood nearby, alone despite dozens of people surrounding them. The divorce was final. The life she'd built for 35 years was destroyed. She'd testified against her husband and helped send him to prison. That kind of thing left you isolated even in crowds. Marcus moved to stand beside her without speaking. Sometimes presence was enough. Sometimes just not being alone made the difference between holding together and falling apart. Rita glanced at him, managed a small smile that acknowledged the gesture, and they stood there together while Sarah finished with the media and the crowd slowly dispersed. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was shorter than the trial, but no less intense. The courtroom was packed again, though the media presence had thinned. The verdict was old news now. Sentencing was just formality. But for the people who'd fought this battle, it mattered deeply. This was where the abstractions of guilty verdicts became concrete reality of years in prison. Judge Huang had reviewed the pre-sentence reports, thick documents detailing every aspect of the defendants' lives and crimes. She'd read victim impact statements, over 40 of them, each one describing harm done by Patricia and Gerald's fraud. She'd considered sentencing guidelines and precedents and the need for both punishment and deterrence. Her job now was to translate all that into numbers, years that would be served, lives that would be spent behind bars. Patricia and Gerald were brought in separately, both wearing prison jumpsuits now instead of the civilian clothes they'd worn during trial. Patricia still maintained her composure, spine straight, face carefully neutral. Gerald looked broken, hunched, and hollow-eyed, like he'd already given up. Judge Huang began with Patricia, asked if she had anything to say before sentencing. Patricia's attorney advised her to show remorse, apologize to the victims, express understanding of the harm caused. But Patricia refused to follow that script. I served this community for 7 years, she said, voice steady. I gave thousands of hours, organized events, maintained property values. Yes, there were accounting irregularities, I've admitted that, but I'm not a murderer. Thomas Chen died of natural causes. This verdict is a miscarriage of justice driven by a grief-stricken widow who couldn't accept reality. The courtroom stirred, but Judge Huang silenced it with a look. She let Patricia finish. Let her dig her grave deeper with every word of denial. Then she delivered sentence with the kind of precision that came from years on the bench. Ms. Thornhill, you were entrusted with managing your community's finances. Instead, you stole over $500,000. When Thomas Chen discovered your crimes, you murdered him to silence him. The jury found you guilty based on overwhelming evidence. Your continued denial shows no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of what you've done. For the murder of Thomas Chen, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. For the fraud, embezzlement, witness tampering, and related charges, I'm imposing concurrent sentences totaling 25 years. These are to run concurrent with the life sentence. You will die in prison, Ms. Thornhill. That is the consequence of your choices. Patricia's facade finally cracked. Not dramatically, just a slight tremor in her jaw, a tightening around her eyes, the reality penetrating whatever wall she'd built against it. She would never be free again. Would never see her home or have coffee with friends or feel mountain air on her face. The rest of her life would be measured in concrete and bars and doors that locked from outside. Gerald's sentencing was harder to watch because his remorse was genuine. His attorney read a statement Gerald had written, apologizing to every victim by name, acknowledging his crimes, expressing understanding that punishment was deserved, begging for mercy he knew he wouldn't receive. Judge Huang's voice softened slightly when she addressed him, but the sentences didn't. 40 years for accessory to murder, 20 years for fraud and embezzlement, to run concurrent. At 61, Gerald would be over 100 before he'd be eligible for release. Effectively a life sentence, just not officially labeled as such. I believe your remorse is genuine, Mr. Masterson, Judge Huang said. But that doesn't erase the harm you caused or the life you helped take. Thomas Chen is dead because you enabled your wife's crimes. Dozens of families were victimized because you chose gambling over integrity. These sentences reflect the severity of what you've done. Derek's sentencing was last. 3 years suspended, 5 years probation, permanent prohibition from public office. Light sentences relative to his crimes, but appropriate given his cooperation and genuine transformation. Judge Huang acknowledged his choice to come forward despite the cost. Mr. Thornhill, you helped commit serious crimes, but you also chose to stop, to tell the truth, to testify despite knowing it meant betraying your mother. That took courage. Your father would have been proud of that choice, even as he'd have been ashamed of the choices that made it necessary. You've been given a second chance. Use it wisely. Derek nodded, unable to speak. The courtroom emptied slowly after that. Patricia and Gerald led away to begin their sentences. Derek walking out alone, free but carrying weight that would never fully lift. Victims gathering in clusters, processing what justice looked like now that it had arrived. That evening, the community gathered at Sarah's house one more time. Not celebration exactly. Celebration felt wrong when someone was dead and nothing could bring him back. But acknowledgement, recognition that the fight was over and they'd won. That justice, however imperfect, had been served. Margaret brought enough food to feed an army, organizing it with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Emma arrived with Hope and her husband David, who'd been part of the fight but quieter about it, supporting his wife through the terror of standing up to authority. Janet and Grace came together, already deep in discussion about the civil suits that would follow now that criminal convictions were secured. Rita came last, hesitant at the door like she wasn't sure she belonged. Sarah saw her and moved immediately to pull her inside. "Your family," Sarah said firmly. "What happened to Gerald doesn't change that. You did the right thing. We're grateful." The evening unfolded in layers, food and conversation and laughter that felt earned after months of tension. Stories about the trial, speculation about what Patricia and Gerald's lives would be like in prison, plans for restructuring the HOA with transparency and accountability built into its foundation. But underneath the practical discussion ran current of something deeper. Gratitude for the community built from crisis. Recognition that fighting corruption together had given them all something they'd been missing. Connection, purpose. proof that ordinary people could still make difference when they refused to accept injustice. Marcus stood in the kitchen helping Margaret organize desserts, feeling oddly at home in a social situation that would have terrified him 3 years ago. Linda had been his social buffer. Without her, he'd retreated into isolation. But these people had pulled him back out, given him reason to engage instead of hide. "You've come a long way," Margaret observed, from the engineer who barely spoke to anyone to the man organizing community potlucks. "I had good teachers," Marcus replied. "All of you showed me that community isn't something to avoid. It's something worth building." Linda would have loved this, all of us together like this. She would have organized it better, made it look effortless instead of chaotic. Margaret laughed. "Probably, but she would have been proud of you for trying." Later, after most people had left and only the core group remained, they gathered in Sarah's living room with the ease of people who'd spent months working together toward common goal. Emma nursed hope while Rita and Grace discussed job opportunities. Amanda showed Janet photos from a trip she'd taken with her mother over Christmas, the first vacation either had managed since Thomas died. Sarah sat beside Marcus on the couch, both of them quiet while the conversations flowed around them. 3 years ago, this room had been tomb. Every surface covered with photos of the dead, every corner thick with grief that had no outlet. Now it was alive with voices and laughter and the sound of baby cooing and future being planned. "We did something good here," Sarah said quietly. "Not just the trial, the community we built." "You built," Marcus corrected. "I just provided technical support." Sarah shook her head. "You were the catalyst, the one who refused to just pay the bill and move on, the one who knocked on my door when I'd given up on everything. You started this." "Linda started it," Marcus said. "Her bucket list, her dream of retirement cabin by the river. I built the bridge to honor her. Everything else grew from that. Some bridges connect more than land." Marcus had heard that phrase before, probably said it himself at some point. But sitting here surrounded by people who'd become family through shared struggle, he understood it differently. The bridge he'd built to honor Linda had connected him to Sarah. Sarah to the women's network, the network to the larger community. One refusal to accept injustice had rippled outward until it touched dozens of lives and changed them all. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "For you?" Sarah considered. "Live. Really live, instead of just existing. Spend time with Amanda. Travel, maybe. Places Thomas and I always planned to see but never got around to. Honor him by enjoying life instead of mourning it." "Sounds like a good plan. What about you?" Marcus thought about the teaching position at the community college he'd accepted, the HOA oversight committee he'd agreed to serve on, the engineering consulting he'd started doing pro bono for community projects. The life he was building that looked nothing like the isolation he'd planned. "Same, I think. Live, build things, help where I can." Linda believed in making the world better through small actions. "I'm learning how to do that." They sat in comfortable silence while the party continued around them. Two people who'd found each other through grief and investigation, and the strange path that led from fraudulent HOA bills to criminal convictions. Not romantic partners, despite what some in the community assumed. Just friends bonded by loss and purpose and the work they'd done together. Eventually everyone left and Sarah walked Marcus to his truck. January air was cold enough to hurt, stars bright enough to read by. The kind of night Linda had loved because it made her feel small in ways that were comforting rather than threatening. "Thank you," Sarah said, "for everything, for refusing to give up, for believing me when I said Thomas was murdered, for building the bridge that connected us all. Thank you for finishing what he started, for being brave when it would have been easier to stay broken." They hugged briefly, the kind of embrace between people who understood each other's pain without needing to discuss it. Then Marcus drove home to his cabin and his bridge and the life he'd built from grief that had somehow become about more than grief. The bridge stood in moonlight, steel and wood and memory made solid. The memorial plaque Marcus had added gleamed where light caught it. Linda Hayes Memorial Bridge, in memory of his wife who believed in justice and community, and in honor of Thomas Chen who gave his life defending truth. Tomorrow, Marcus would teach his first engineering class. Next week, he'd meet with the new HOA board to implement the transparent accounting systems he'd designed. Next month, he'd work with civil attorneys on calculating damages for victims who'd lost money to Patricia's fraud. He had work, had purpose, had reason to wake up and engage with world instead of hiding from it. They went back inside to join the others, to eat too much food and tell stories about the trial, and make plans for the civil suits and the HOA restructuring and all the work that remained. The battle was won, but the rebuilding had just begun. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Sarah found the coffee mug that had been Thomas's. It still sat in its usual spot on the kitchen table, still part of the morning ritual that had sustained her through 3 years of grief and investigation and trial. But it felt different now, less like shrine and more like reminder. Thomas was gone, but his impact remained. The community he'd died protecting was stronger for his sacrifice. The truth he'd pursued had been vindicated. His death had meaning beyond loss. Sarah washed the mug for the first time in 3 years, put it in the cabinet with the others instead of leaving it on the table. The ritual was complete. She could honor Thomas now by living fully instead of maintaining eternal vigil. Marcus drove home thinking about the life he'd rebuilt. The memorial plaque on his bridge gleamed in moonlight. Linda Hayes Memorial Bridge, built in memory of his wife who believed in justice and community, and in honor of Thomas Chen, who gave his life defending truth. He had purpose now, had community, had reason to keep building instead of just maintaining what was already done. Linda's photo still sat on his nightstand, but when he talked to her that night, it was different. "We did it, Linda. Got justice for Thomas and Sarah and everyone they hurt. Built something good from all this pain. I think you'd be proud." The photo didn't answer. It never did. But Marcus felt peace anyway. He was living again instead of just surviving, helping others instead of isolating, building community instead of hiding from it. Grief would always be there. The loss of Linda was permanent. But it didn't have to define him. He could carry his love for her, while also caring about other things. Other people. The work that needed doing. Some bridges connected more than land. Some connected hearts across impossible distances. Some connected the living to the dead through the work that honored both. Marcus had built his bridge to escape grief. Instead, it had taught him how to live with it, how to transform loss into purpose and isolation into community. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything Linda would have wanted for him. The county council meeting to dissolve the Riverbend Estates HOA happened on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after sentencing. The community center was packed beyond capacity. People standing along walls and crowding doorways because everyone wanted to witness the official end of an organization that had terrorized them for years. Mayor Gregson presided with the gravity the moment deserved. This wasn't just administrative procedure. This was liberation. In light of criminal convictions against the HOA's president and vice president for fraud, embezzlement, and murder, the council votes to immediately dissolve the Riverbend Estates HOA charter. All covenants, liens, and pending enforcement actions are hereby voided. Community assets will be transferred to temporary county administration, pending establishment of new governance structure if residents choose to create one. The room erupted in applause. People who'd lived in fear for years, suddenly free from arbitrary fines and threats of foreclosure. Elderly residents no longer worried about losing homes over invented violations. Young families released from the terror of random assessments they couldn't afford. The relief was physical, visible in shoulders that relaxed and faces that lost the tight anxiety that had become permanent. But freedom created its own questions. Who would maintain common areas, coordinate snow removal, organize emergency communication? A community needed some structure, or it dissolved into chaos. The challenge was building something that served without controlling, something transparent instead of corrupt, something accountable to residents instead of accountable to no one. Marcus had been thinking about this for weeks, engineering solutions to organizational problems. He'd drafted a proposal with input from Margaret and Janet and others who'd fought the battle. A new model, voluntary instead of mandatory, transparent instead of secretive, limited in power instead of authoritarian. The Riverbend Community Alliance, not an HOA, not mandatory membership, Just voluntary cooperation around specific shared needs. No fines, no liens, no architectural control, no power to force anyone to do anything. Members would pay annual dues only if they chose to participate. Those dues would fund basic services like road maintenance, emergency communication systems, and community events. Governance would be radically transparent. All financial records posted online and updated monthly. Any member could request full accounting of any expenditure within 5 business days. Board members would serve 2-year terms maximum, with no possibility of re-election. No vendor contracts without competitive bidding and independent oversight. No decision affecting private property without unanimous consent from affected owners. The proposal passed with 87% approval. Elections for the first Community Alliance Board happened the following week. Sarah was nominated for president despite protests that she was too old and too tired and had already done her part. Margaret's nomination speech left no room for argument. Sarah Chen spent 3 years fighting corruption while grieving her murdered husband. She organized us when we were scattered. She never gave up when giving up would have been easier. If anyone can make sure we never repeat Patricia's mistakes, it's Sarah. The vote was unanimous. Sarah accepted and immediately assembled her team. Marcus as vice president and infrastructure coordinator, Frank Morrison as safety and emergency planning director, Emma Rodriguez as community events and family liaison, Ed Wilson as financial oversight officer, because a man who'd been victimized by financial fraud would never let it happen again. Their first official act was approving a charter that explicitly prohibited everything Patricia had done. Marcus helped draft the language with precision from 30 years of writing engineering specifications that had to be absolutely clear. The final document was 10 pages, short enough to actually read, clear enough to actually understand. Derek Thornhill began his community service 2 weeks after sentencing. 500 hours ordered by the court. Judge Huang allowed him to serve in Riverbend because Sarah requested it. Derek had helped hurt these people. Let him help repair the damage while they watched. The first day he showed up wearing county-issued work vests that marked him as court-ordered service. Several residents turned their backs. He was Patricia's son. He'd falsified government records. He'd enabled her crimes. Some people couldn't forgive that no matter what he did now. Derek didn't argue or make excuses. Just put on work gloves and started repairing the playground equipment his mother had billed residents to restore, but never actually fixed. The swings had been broken for 2 years. Chains rusted. Seats cracked. The slide had sharp edges where paint had peeled away. Derek worked with intensity that went beyond court requirements. He replaced every chain, bought new seats with his own money, sanded and repainted the entire structure with marine-grade coating that would last decades. Each swing set he fixed was small penance for larger sins. Marcus watched him work from a distance that first week. The kid looked haunted. 28 years old, but moving like someone much older, shoulders bent under weight that wasn't physical. Every task performed with care that suggested he was trying to prove something. By the second week, the silent treatment started cracking. A mother with 2 young children approached cautiously. Melissa Grant. Patricia had charged her family $1,800 for fence repair. There was no fence on their property. "My kids want to use the playground," she said. "Is it safe now?" Derek stood, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yes, ma'am. Tested every piece myself. It's safer than it's ever been." Melissa paused, wrestling with something. "What your mother did hurt my family. We struggled after paying that bill. Had to choose between groceries and utilities some months. Do you understand what that's like?" Derek's voice came out thick. "No, ma'am, I don't. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but it's all I have." She studied him for a long moment. "My husband wants me to hate you, but I see you here every day working in weather that's too hot or too cold. That counts for something, not forgiveness necessarily, but acknowledgement." The next day she brought him water during lunch break. Small gesture that meant more than grand forgiveness would have. By the 4th week, elderly Martha Simmons asked if he could help fix her porch railing that had been loose for months. She was 82 and lived alone. Derek spent his Saturday doing the repair for free, outside his required hours. He didn't just fix the loose railing. He inspected the entire porch structure, found rotting boards that would have failed within a year, replaced them without being asked. Martha made him lunch. They sat on her newly solid porch and talked. She told him about her husband who died 8 years ago, about the community she'd watched change from friendly to fearful under Patricia's leadership. "Your father coached my grandson in Little League," Martha said, 20 years ago now. "He was kind to boys who weren't naturally athletic. You have his eyes. I see him in you when you're working." Derek had to excuse himself to cry in his truck. First real comparison to his father that wasn't about disappointment. He came back composed and finished the work. But Martha's words became touchstone he returned to when weight got too heavy. 3 months into his service, Sarah invited him to coffee. They sat at a small cafe in town, both uncomfortable, both knowing this conversation mattered. Sarah spoke first. "Your mother killed my husband. You helped her commit fraud. I want you to know I haven't forgiven that. Maybe I never will, but I see you trying to make amends. That counts for something." Derek's hand shook around his coffee cup. "Mrs. Chen, I know nothing I do can fix what happened. I know 500 hours doesn't balance the scales. But work is all I have to offer. Your father was a good man," Sarah said. "Thomas talked about him, how he coached with patience. He would have been ashamed of what you did, but he also would have been proud that you came forward, that you testified. Thomas believed people could change if they chose to. I'm choosing to believe that about you. Don't make me regret it." The conversation shifted to logistics. Derek mentioned studying for paralegal certification, wanted to help people navigate legal systems ethically. Sarah suggested he volunteer with legal aid once his probation ended, use knowledge of how systems could be manipulated to help protect people from manipulation. It became monthly coffee dates after that. Sarah mentoring Derek in ways his mother never had, teaching him about integrity and service and the difference between power and leadership. Rita Shaw, formerly Rita Masterson, rebuilt her life methodically, filed for divorce, reclaimed her maiden name, found an apartment, got hired back at the pharmacy she'd retired from 5 years earlier. Each action was small. Together, they added up to new life. The community welcomed her without reservation. She was victim, not perpetrator. She'd lost 35 years of marriage to a man who turned out to be a stranger. She'd provided evidence that helped convict him. That earned respect. Margaret invited her to join the women's group that met weekly. Not the investigation team anymore. Just women who'd bonded through crisis and stayed bonded through choice. They talked about books and politics and grandchildren, the mundane details of life that had been overshadowed by trials and investigations. Rita found herself laughing at one of these meetings for the first time in months. Margaret told a story about her teaching days, and the whole room dissolved into laughter. Rita felt something inside shift, permission to feel joy despite everything. "You're healing," Emma observed. "Takes time, but it happens." "Does it?" Rita asked. "Some days I wake up and remember I'm 59 and starting over, and I want to stay in bed." "But you don't," Sarah pointed out. "You get up, you go to work, you come to these meetings, you choose to keep going. That's healing." Rita realized it was true. She was choosing. Every day. To live through the pain instead of being paralyzed by it. That was progress. The civil suits moved forward. The criminal convictions made liability uncontestable. Patricia's house sold for $380,000. Gerald's insurance business for $210,000. Additional assets brought the total to $852,000. After legal fees, $720,000 remained for distribution. The court appointed a special master to allocate based on proven damages plus hardship factors. Emma and David Rodriguez received $7,100. Ed Wilson got $6,800. Sarah received $6,500, including wrongful death compensation. But Sarah donated her entire amount to establish the Thomas Chen Community Integrity Fund, a grant program for residents facing financial hardship, medical emergencies, job loss, unexpected expenses. The fund would provide interest-free loans or direct grants, administered by committee that included Rita and Emma and others who understood financial desperation. Marcus received $9,100 for his fraudulent bridge bill plus legal expenses. He donated it to the Rodriguez family, put it toward your daughter's college fund, the real one this time. David tried to refuse, but Marcus was insistent. "Linda and I never had kids. Couldn't, for medical reasons. Always wished we could contribute to the next generation. Let me do it this way." Emma cried and hugged him while holding hope. The baby grabbed Marcus's finger with instinctive infant grip. Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. connection to future instead of just past. 1 year after the verdict, the community planned Bridge Day celebration, annual gathering to commemorate justice served. Margaret coordinated with her usual efficiency. Emma handled social media. Frank organized parking and safety. Over 200 people planned to attend. But 3 days before the event, the weather turned savage. Heavy rains that had been predicted as scattered showers intensified into deluge that meteorologists started calling once-in-a-century event. The creek behind Marcus's cabin, normally placid and knee-deep, swelled to raging torrent within hours. Marcus watched the water rise from his porch, engineers' mind calculating flow rates and load factors. The bridge he'd built was over-engineered, could handle far more than normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. This was the kind of flood that washed away infrastructure designed for predictable scenarios. His phone rang. Frank Morrison, voice tight with controlled urgency. Marcus, we've got a situation. The old access road just washed out completely. 5 families downstream are cut off. Water's rising fast. Emergency services can't reach them from the main road. Your bridge is the only access point left. How bad? Bad. Rodriguez family has infant and a toddler. Simmons is 82 and can't evacuate on foot through water. 3 other families include elderly and disabled. We need to get them out now before water gets higher. Marcus looked at his bridge. Water already lapping at the support beams. Still structurally sound, but rising. In an hour, maybe 2, it might be impassable. After that, those families would be trapped. I'm heading there now, Marcus said. Call search and rescue. Tell them to stage at my property. The bridge will hold. He grabbed his emergency kit and headed out into rain that felt like standing under waterfall. At the bridge, he found Derek already there, soaking wet, testing the deck boards. What are you doing here? Marcus shouted over the roar of water. Derek looked up, rain streaming down his face. I heard the emergency call on my radio. Knew you'd need help. This bridge can handle the load, right? Marcus studied the structure he'd built. Every weld, every bolt, every support beam placed with precision that assumed worst-case scenarios because that's how engineers thought. He'd built this to last. Now it needed to prove it. It'll hold, Marcus said. Let's get those people out. The first family arrived within minutes. Young parents with 2 kids under 5, terror in their eyes as they crossed the bridge while water churned 3 feet below the deck. Marcus and Derek guided them across, hands steady, voices calm despite the chaos. Then Martha Simmons, moving slowly with her walker, Derek on one side and a firefighter on the other. The old woman looked at Derek with recognition. You fixed my porch, she said. Made it safe. Now you're making sure I'm safe too. Yes, ma'am, Derek replied. Almost there. You're doing great. More families came. Each crossing felt like eternity. Water rising inch by inch, the bridge groaning under sustained assault from current that carried debris and tried to tear the structure apart. But Marcus's engineering held. Every overbuilt specification, every redundant support, every decision to exceed code requirements instead of just meeting them. All of it mattered now. The Rodriguez family came last. Emma carrying Hope, David with their son Thomas. The water had risen to within 18 inches of the bridge deck. Waves were starting to splash across the surface. Another 30 minutes, and it would be underwater. Move quickly but carefully, Marcus instructed. Derek, you take the rear. They started across. Halfway over, a massive log slammed into the upstream side of the bridge. The impact shuddered through the structure. Emma screamed. David nearly lost his footing. Derek grabbed his arm, steadied him. Keep going, Derek shouted. We're almost there. They reached safety just as another surge pushed water over the deck. Marcus made the call. Bridge is closed. No more crossings until the water recedes. 14 people evacuated, all safe. 0 casualties. The bridge had done what Marcus built it to do. Carried people to safety when everything else failed. The families gathered at Marcus's cabin because it was on high ground and he had generator power when the grid went down. They sat in his living room wrapped in blankets, drinking hot coffee, processing what had just happened, processing that they'd almost been trapped, that they could have died, that a bridge built by a grieving engineer and defended by a young man seeking redemption had saved their lives. Emma approached Marcus, holding Hope. I never properly thanked you for fighting the HOA, for building this bridge, for being stubborn enough not to just pay that bill and move on. If you had, we'd be trapped right now. Maybe worse. I just built a bridge, Marcus said. You built more than that. You built a way out for all of us. From Patricia's corruption, from tonight's flood. You built connection when we needed it most. Martha Simmons pulled Derek aside. Young man, you made mistakes. Big ones. But tonight you helped save my life. Your father would be proud of the man you're becoming. Derek broke down then. All the months of service and silent judgment and slow redemption culminating in this moment. Being told he'd made his father proud, that he'd done something that mattered, that his choices to change had actual impact. Sarah found him later, sitting alone on the porch watching the floodwater begin to recede. She sat beside him without speaking for a long moment. You saved lives tonight, she said finally, including the Rodriguez baby, including Martha. You could have stayed home. It wasn't your responsibility, but you showed up. I had to, Derek replied. After everything I did to hurt this community, I had to do something to help. You've been doing that for months. Tonight just made it visible. Thomas would have done exactly what you did. Showed up in the crisis, helped without being asked. That's the kind of man he was. That's the kind of man you're becoming. Derek nodded, unable to speak. The flood receded over the next 2 days. The bridge stood exactly as Marcus built it. Not a single structural compromise, not a bolt loosened, not a beam shifted. When county engineers came to inspect, they stood in professional awe. This is the most overbuilt pedestrian bridge I've ever seen, the lead engineer said. You designed for loads 10 times higher than you'd ever reasonably encounter. It's engineering overkill. It's engineering that saves lives, Marcus corrected. Sometimes overkill is exactly right. The story made regional news. Engineer's personal bridge saves 14 during historic flood. Photos of Marcus and Derek helping evacuate families. Interviews with Martha Simmons, praising the young man who'd fixed her porch and then saved her life. Coverage of the community that had fought HOA corruption and now demonstrated what real community looked like in crisis. Derek's probation officer called him the day after, said the video of him helping with evacuations had been forwarded to the judge. Judge Huang wanted to commend his actions, was considering early termination of probation based on demonstrated rehabilitation and community service that went beyond court requirements. 2 weeks later, Derek stood before Judge Huang again. Different context than sentencing, this time as young man who'd proven he'd changed. Mr. Thornhill, I sentenced you to 5 years probation for your role in your mother's crimes. You've served 1 year. In that year, you've completed your community service hours with distinction. You've pursued education to help others navigate legal systems. And during the recent flood, you risked your own safety to help evacuate families without being asked or required to do so. That demonstrates genuine transformation. I'm terminating your probation effective today. You're a free man. Use that freedom wisely. Derek walked out of that courtroom and called Sarah immediately. She met him at their usual coffee shop. I'm free, he said. Legally. Finally. But I don't feel free. I feel responsible. Like I need to keep proving I deserve it. That's called integrity, Sarah replied. The work of becoming better doesn't end just because the court says so. But you should feel proud. You earned this. What do I do now? Live, help people, be the man your father raised you to be instead of the man your mother's choices tried to make you. And accept that redemption isn't a destination, it's a daily choice. Derek completed his paralegal certification that spring after months of night classes while working full-time. The studying had been difficult after years away from formal education. But Sarah tutored him through the hardest concepts, helped him understand legal procedures and documentation requirements, made sure he passed the certification exam on first try. His first client through legal aid was an elderly veteran, being threatened with eviction over disputed rent calculations. Derek spent hours reviewing the lease agreement, comparing it to state tenant laws, documenting every discrepancy. He found that the landlord had been overcharging for 3 years. Not just his client, but 6 other tenants in the same building. Same pattern as what his mother had done. Same exploitation of people who didn't know how to fight back. Derek built the case methodically, filed complaints with housing authority, negotiated settlement that recovered over $15,000 for the 7 tenants, made sure the landlord faced penalties that would deter future exploitation. When his client, a 74-year-old man who'd served in Vietnam, shook his hand with tears in his eyes, Derek felt something shift. This was what using knowledge to help instead of hurt felt like. This was redemption measured not in hours served, but in lives actually improved. Word spread about the young paralegal who worked for free and actually won cases. More clients came. Single mothers fighting unfair debt collection, elderly residents navigating Medicare denial letters, families dealing with predatory lending. Each case was opportunity to prove he'd changed, to demonstrate that expertise in systems could be used to protect instead of manipulate. One afternoon, he sat across from a client who'd been charged $1,800 in overdraft fees by a bank that had rearranged transaction order to maximize penalties. The amount matched exactly what Melissa Grant's family had been charged in the fake fence repair. Derek saw the parallel immediately. Different scam, same math, same targeting of people who couldn't afford to fight. "This is exactly the kind of thing my mother did," he told his supervisor. Used complexity of systems to steal from people who didn't understand they could push back. "I want to stop this. All of it, not just this case, but the pattern." His supervisor, a veteran legal aid attorney named Patricia Rodriguez, who'd spent 30 years fighting for low-income clients, studied him carefully. "You can't save everyone, Derek. You'll burn out if you try." "Maybe, but I have to try anyway. I helped hurt people for years. Spent the rest of my life helping seems like fair trade." Patricia smiled. "That's the attitude that makes good advocates. Just remember to pace yourself. Marathon, not sprint." Derek took her advice but pushed himself anyway. Worked 60-hour weeks between his day job and pro bono cases. Helped 53 clients in his first year. Recovered over $200,000 in fraudulent charges, denied benefits, and illegal fees. Each dollar recovered felt like small payment against the debt he'd accumulated through his mother's crimes and his complicity. He moved to Asheville eventually after a year of service in Riverbend. The community had forgiven him, but living there meant constant reminders of what his mother had done and who he'd been when he helped her. He needed psychological space to build identity that was his instead of defined by her shadow. Needed to be Derek Thornhill, the paralegal who helped people, instead of Derek Thornhill, the son of the woman who'd committed murder. But he came back monthly without fail. Attended community alliance meetings. Helped with legal paperwork when the alliance needed contracts reviewed or compliance issues addressed. Maintained connection to the place where he'd learned the hardest lessons and found the strength to change. Riverbend wasn't home anymore, but it was foundation, the bedrock his new life was built on. The first Bridge Day celebration happened 6 months after the flood, on a Saturday in June, when mountain weather was perfect and wildflowers covered the meadow in colors that looked painted on. Over 300 people gathered to commemorate the anniversary of the verdict and to honor the bridge that had twice saved the community. Once from corruption by refusing to legitimize Patricia's fake authority. Once from natural disaster by providing escape route when everything else failed. Marcus had spent weeks adding elements to the bridge in preparation. The original memorial plaque honoring Linda was joined by second one listing every resident who'd been charged fraudulent fees. 47 names total. Not to shame them for being victimized, but to honor them for surviving and for finding courage to come forward. For trusting that justice might actually be possible if enough people demanded it. And a third plaque now, brass polished to mirror shine, mounted on the upstream side where floodwater had tried and failed to tear the structure apart. 14 names engraved in clean sans serif font, the people evacuated during the flood. Emma Rodriguez and daughter Hope, David Rodriguez and son Thomas, Martha Simmons, the Grant family, the Chen family, no relation to Thomas and Sarah, but coincidence that made everyone smile. 3 more families whose names were now permanently recorded as people this bridge had saved. At the bottom of the plaque, inscription Marcus had labored over for days before getting it right. Some bridges connect land, some save lives. This bridge did both, and beneath that, smaller text. Built by Marcus Hayes in memory of Linda Hayes. Defended by Derek Thornhill seeking redemption. Proof that good work done for right reasons serves purposes beyond what builders imagine. The celebration had been Emma's idea. She'd argued that the community needed ritual, needed annual gathering that acknowledged where they'd been and where they were going. needed marker to prevent forgetting. Margaret had agreed immediately and taken over organization with efficiency that made complex logistics look effortless. Frank handled safety protocols and parking. Sarah sent personal invitations to every family that had been victimized by Patricia's fraud. The gathering felt like old-fashioned church picnic. Everyone brought food representing their heritage. Italian pasta from the Rossi family who'd been charged for drainage work never performed. Mexican tamales from the Rodriguez clan. Korean barbecue from the Kims who'd paid $3,000 for community fence that didn't exist. Soul food from the Washingtons. Polish pierogi from the Kowalskis. Indian samosas from the Patels. The tables overflowed with dishes that told story of who these people were and where they'd come from and how they'd survived together. Children played on the bridge without understanding its significance. To them, it was just a sturdy place to run and climb and dare each other to look down at the water below. They didn't know about HOA corruption or murder trials or flood evacuations. They just knew it was safe, that adults had tested it and approved it and let them play there without constant warnings to be careful. The bridge was part of their landscape like mountains and trees, permanent, reliable, built right. Marcus watched them play and thought about legacy, how the best structures became invisible precisely because they work so well, how buildings and bridges and systems that functioned properly faded into background, while only broken things demanded attention. This bridge had become part of the community's infrastructure in the deepest sense. Not just physical connection between properties, but symbol of what happened when good work was done for right reasons by people who refused to compromise on quality or integrity. At 2 in the afternoon, Sarah stood on the bridge and spoke to the crowd gathered on both banks and in the meadow beyond. She'd prepared remarks, written them out carefully the night before. But standing there with 300 faces looking at her expectantly, she abandoned the script. Some things needed to come from heart, not outline. 4 years ago, my husband Thomas discovered that people we elected to serve us were stealing from us. He spent his last weeks documenting their crimes. He died before he could see justice. For 3 years, I lived with knowledge that he'd been murdered and fear that no one would believe me when I said the autopsy was wrong. That good men didn't just drop dead from heart attacks at 68 with no prior symptoms. That the timing was too convenient. That something was terribly wrong. Then Marcus Hayes refused to pay a fraudulent bill for a bridge he'd built with his own hands. That refusal started everything, connected us to each other, gave us courage to fight together instead of suffering alone. One man saying no to injustice became catalyst for entire community saying no. That's power. That's what changes things. Not waiting for someone else to save you, but finding others and saving each other. We took down corrupt leaders. We exposed systematic fraud that had stolen over $500,000 from our neighbors. We got justice for Thomas and for everyone Patricia and Gerald hurt. But more than that, we proved something important. That ordinary people refusing to be silent can change everything. That community built on truth is stronger than power built on fear. That integrity matters even when, especially when, fighting for it costs something. Her voice strengthened as she continued. This bridge started as one man's memorial to his wife Linda, who died too young from cancer. Marcus built it to honor her memory, to create something permanent in a world that had taken her away too soon. It became symbol of resistance when he refused to let corrupt officials steal it through fake charges and manufactured authority. It became literal lifeline 6 months ago, when floodwaters cut off families, and this bridge was the only escape route left. That's what good work does. Serves purposes beyond what the builder intended. Marcus designed this bridge to carry him across a creek to a cabin where he could grieve in private. Instead, it carried all of us across from corruption to integrity, from isolation to community, from fear to strength. And when nature itself tried to divide us, it carried 14 people to safety and proved that building things right matters in ways we can't always predict. She paused, looking directly at faces she'd come to know over 4 years of fighting together. Thomas died pursuing truth. Marcus built a bridge pursuing peace. I pursued justice. Derek pursued redemption. Rita pursued healing. Emma pursued safety for her children. Margaret pursued community. Frank pursued security. Every one of us pursued something personal, but together we built something larger. We built proof that good people working together can defeat corruption, that ordinary citizens armed with evidence and courage can hold powerful people accountable. That community isn't just nice idea, it's practical necessity. We need each other. We're stronger together. And when we choose to connect instead of isolate, we can survive anything. The crowd erupted in applause that started, scattered, and built like wave. People standing, some crying, all of them acknowledging what they'd been through together and what they'd built from it. 300 individuals who'd been atomized by fear under Patricia's regime finding collective voice, finding power in unity, finding proof that the work of building community was worth every ounce of effort it required. Marcus found himself suddenly surrounded by people wanting to thank him, shake his hand, tell him how the bridge had affected their lives beyond the obvious, how fighting Patricia had given them courage to stand up in their own situations, how the transparency of the new community alliance had restored faith in governance, how seeing Derek's redemption had made them believe second chances were possible for people willing to earn them. A middle-aged woman he didn't recognize approached with teenage daughter. "I wanted you to meet my daughter Maya," she said. "She's 15 and wants to be an engineer. I told her about your bridge and how it was built right even when no one was checking, how it saved lives because you cared about quality more than speed or cost. She wanted to meet the engineer who proved that good work matters." Marcus shook the teenager's hand, saw curiosity and determination in her eyes. "Engineering is about more than math and materials," he told her. "It's about service, building things that help people, doing work that matters. Make sure whatever you build it to last. Build it to serve. Build it right even when no one's checking, because someday someone's life might depend on it." The girl nodded seriously, clearly taking it to heart. "Thank you," she said. "I won't forget that." Marcus watched her walk away and thought about legacy again. Not just the physical bridge, but the principles it represented. The idea that good work mattered, that integrity wasn't negotiable, that building things right was its own reward, that sometimes paid dividends you never expected. If that lesson reached even one young person and influenced how they approached their work, then everything he'd built meant something beyond its physical utility. As the celebration continued into evening, families gathered for group photo on and around the bridge. Children in front sitting cross-legged, adults standing in rows behind, elderly residents in chairs at the edges. Everyone squeezed together, connected by shared history and shared hope for different future. 300 people trying to fit in single frame. The photographer, a professional who'd volunteered his time because his mother had been one of Patricia's victims, took dozens of shots to make sure everyone was included. Marcus found himself in the back row between Sarah and Rita. 3 people who'd started the fight from different angles converged through circumstance into alliance that had changed everything. The engineer who refused to pay, the widow who refused to forget, the wife who refused to protect a criminal just because she'd married him. Different starting points, same destination, same commitment to truth over convenience. "We did it," Sarah said quietly, while waiting for the photographer to finish setting up. "Finished what Thomas started. Built something that will last. More than that," Rita added. "We healed. I didn't think I could at 59. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life being Gerald's ex-wife, defined by his crimes and my failure to see them. But I'm Rita Shaw now, not Rita Masterson. I'm dating someone wonderful. I have job I love. I have friends who matter. I have life that's mine." "That's the real victory," Marcus agreed. "Not just taking down bad people, but building good lives after. Not just fighting corruption, but creating something better to replace it." The photo session took 30 minutes. Everyone wanted copies. Emma promised to email digital versions to entire community. Margaret started organizing album of photos from the entire 4-year journey. Investigation meetings, trial attendance, verdict celebration, flood evacuation, first bridge day, creating visual records so future generations would know the full story. As the sun started setting and families began packing up, Marcus stood alone on his bridge one more time. Linda's photo was in his wallet, but no longer the constant companion it had been for years. He'd learned to live without needing her to validate every choice, had internalized her values enough that he could make decisions she'd approve of without constantly consulting her ghost. He pulled out the photo anyway, one last time in this particular way. Tomorrow it would go in special place in his cabin, protected, honored, but not carried everywhere like talisman against grief. Linda, I'm ready now. Ready to live without needing you to tell me how. Ready to make choices because they're right, not because you'd approve. Ready to be happy without feeling guilty that you're not here to be happy with me. I'll always love you, always miss you, always be grateful for the years we had. But I'm ready to build the years ahead without you as my primary guide. He looked at her frozen smile, captured in moment of joy from life lived fully before cancer stole it. She'd want this, want him to thrive instead of just survive, want him to build and connect and live with the intensity she'd always had. The photo went back in his wallet. Tomorrow, it would find new home. Tonight, it was still part of his daily routine. But he felt the transition happening, grief transforming from crushing weight into something he could carry, loss becoming part of his story instead of the entire story, love for Linda informing his choices without dictating them. Tomorrow, he'd teach his engineering class. Next week, he'd help the new HOA board implement transparent accounting. Next month, he'd consult on community infrastructure projects. He had work, had purpose, had reason to keep building. But tonight, he allowed himself this moment, standing on structure he'd built to escape grief. Structure that had taught him grief transformed wasn't grief erased, that loving Linda meant honoring her values by living fully, by connecting instead of isolating, by building things that served beyond personal need. The bridge stood solid beneath him, steel and wood and memory made permanent, built to last, built to serve, built with integrity that meant it would still be standing long after everyone who knew its story was gone. That was enough. That was everything. That was the bridge between grief and grace, built one beam at a time by ordinary people who refused to let fear win. And when crisis came, it did exactly what it was built to do: carried people to safety, connected them when everything else failed, proved that the work of building right mattered more than anyone knew when the building began. Marcus walked back to join the celebration. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work to do, new connections to build. But tonight, surrounded by community forged in crisis and strengthened through choice, he allowed himself to simply be present, connected, alive. Linda would have loved this. Thomas would have been proud. And Marcus finally could accept both truths without the weight of grief crushing him, could carry their memories while building new ones, could honor the past while embracing the future. Some bridges connected land to land. Some connected people to people. Some connected who you were to who you could become. Marcus had built all three without meaning to, and that, he realized, was the point. The best work often accomplished more than its builder intended. The strongest communities formed around shared struggle and sustained through shared choice. The deepest healing came not from forgetting pain, but from transforming it into purpose. The bridge would stand, the community would thrive, and Marcus would keep building, keep connecting, keep proving that ordinary people doing good work for right reasons could change everything. That was legacy enough. That was more than enough. That was everything Linda and Thomas and everyone who'd fought this fight had believed possible. The bridge stood in evening light, children's laughter echoing across the water, families gathering for photos, community celebrating not just victory but survival and transformation, and the hard-won knowledge that together they were stronger than any corruption that tried to divide them. And Marcus, standing at the edge watching it all, finally understood what Linda had been trying to teach him through 40 years of marriage: that the answer to grief wasn't isolation, it was connection, that the way through pain wasn't around it, but directly into it, and out the other side. That bridges built with integrity saved more than just the people who crossed them. They saved the builders too.